I'm doing it right now. It's recording right now.
Oh, it's recording. Okay, great.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we're looking at this program NetLogo, and this is a really nice program for exploring these complex systems. And so we were just discussing this idea of a heuristic and solving problems with just sort of a strategy of some kind. And so we're going to look at how these really, really simple systems can solve some of these problems by sort of acting almost like at this neuron level, right? So we were talking about in the Andrew Coward talk that the neurons, they only know what they know and they don't have access to something else. That's the same is true with these ants that we're going to simulate. And a real ant in the real world, or a real bacteria or a real cell in your body, it only has connections to what it knows. And I think the real fascinating thing is, how do they do anything at all? And so that's this idea of emergence and this idea of emergent heuristic, that it can solve the problem. And last time there was a really great question and comment about, looking at these models about, how do we know that this really reflects a complex system, or rather a complicated system? And I think that's where the English language is going to let us down a little bit, and we're going to need some subtle distinctions in the vocabulary. When we say complex system, we don't necessarily mean a system you would encounter in the real world. And what I mean by that is, let's say you're doing sea turtle research, and there's a lot of complexities and complications involved in studying sea turtles. You're going to want to keep track of their whole growth cycle. You're going to keep track of their DNA. You're going to remember that this one is Tony and that one is Chuck, and all of these different details about that. So that's sort of, how to manage the complexity of a modern experiment. But that's very different than this idea of complex systems. And so the tools that we're going to learn in this course will very much help you if you're studying sea turtles or anything else that happens to be kind of rather complicated. But the idea of complex systems is really something altogether different. It's actually a simple system. It's something that's ridiculously simple, or as simple as possible, and yet still at the same time is going to demonstrate something that was either counterintuitive or can solve sort of a problem that might seem like it would require a higher level of thinking, like with these ants. So let's jump in with these ants, and we're going to take a look at this real quick again, and then we're going to look at something called percolation. And I put together a nice notebook for that. So to remind ourselves, we're in this agent-based world. I'm just going to go ahead and run this. I like to slow it down, makes it a little more exciting, like it's actually having to do some computing work. The computers run so fast now, it takes all the fun out of it. But what we have here is we have a simulated number of agents. We get to pick how many. We have a population of 125. The computer is drawing them as little red ants. That's just for fun. The computer doesn't know they're ants. The shape of the ant has no effect on the simulation of anything like that. That's just for humans to help us bring metaphors to the table. But I think that's very powerful. As human beings, you know a lot about ants, certainly if you live in South Florida. And so I think these things can really help us, they help me think about very sophisticated math models, but you can kind of bring them very close to home by putting a little ant logo on it, by putting a little icon on it that makes it look like a red ant. Will help activate other parts of your brain that will help you think meaningfully about these problems. So what we're noticing about this simulation is each ant is doing a random walk, like we simulated last time, and it's just kind of bumping around. And then when the ant happens to bump into one of these piles out on the edge here, it's going to pick up that little piece, and then it's going to start walking home. It has a general idea of which direction home is to kind of simplify the simulation. But what it's really drawing here is this pheromone trail. If you've ever seen real ants, they actually sort of dip their tail as they walk around. You can see this as they run. And they're going to leave this pheromone trail. And we had said last time that if I give you a can of spray paint or a jar of perfume, and I have you make a couple trips across campus of 2 different trips. So I say, here, go from this one classroom here to right here on the 3rd floor to the other room across the hall. Then you're going to be able to spray your spray paint very densely. Your sort of single can of spray paint. Or I can imagine a perfume. You're going to spread out that perfume equally across that short distance, and you'll get a very strong signal. I guess if I go like that, then they can probably see the screen better. So then you're going to get a strong sort of signal here. Now what's going to happen is the wind and the weather are actually doing a lot of the work, and surprisingly a lot of the thinking. And I think this is where it gets really fascinating and strange, is that part of this algorithm, part of the ants, the way they're doing it, it has to do with this evaporation. So let me just reset this and change the evaporation rate, right? So now the wind is blowing like crazy, or the chemistry of their trail is such that it doesn't persist. right? And so now what's going to happen is the algorithm doesn't work anymore, right? So there was this property, there's this action that was happening at above the organism level, in the environment level. The environment was doing this thing called evaporation. If we lower this evaporation, you can now see that the trails persist and it stays. And we'll look at this kind of diffusion, how we can model that with blurring. It's really straightforward. But I think it's really fascinating because the environment is really helping doing some of the thinking. I like to joke that the ants wear their heart on their sleeve. And what I mean is that their ideas, their brain is literally on the outside. When, as human beings, when we want to think of something, hopefully you'll remember something about the content of this lecture next week, you're changing pieces of your brain on the inside. Something about the neuronal pathways are changing around, and you'll be able to remember vaguely something about what this lecture was about with the ants, hopefully. The idea is the ants are changing, but they're changing the outside. They're changing the world itself. And I think this is really fascinating to think about intelligence and to think about distributed intelligence and, where is the brain or where is the intelligence of this colony? It's not in any one of the ants. If we take one ant out of a colony, you're not really going to disturb that colony, assuming it's not the queen. And that's kind of true with neurons, right? So if you play football or you go to the after party or whatever, you might learn you lose a few neurons, and this isn't going to fundamentally change the operation of your brain. But continuously over many times, then it would. So if I were to take out some fraction of the ants, which we can do, we can cut the population of ants in half, and we say if there were only 70 or so, can it still sort of operate in this heuristic fashion of building a trail and then reinforcing the closest trail? So to remember what the interesting thing is that they will eat this pile first, and then they will eat this pile, and then they will eat that pile. And that makes sense. They're learning to exploit the closest resources. But how do they know that's the closest resource, right? That's what's just so interesting about this.
Can I just?
Yeah,
Well,
please jump in.
I was just going to say, and coming back to kind of to Rachel's point, is that you can imagine this happening even internally. You have a brain and a body, and the brain will, it'll leave a signal somewhere in the body. Like sometimes, you feel an emotion in your gut, and your brain kind of places it there as a to some extent a memory that that there's something, let's say that there's something you're upset about, right? And it places a memory in your body that I'm upset now, and it sort of outsourced that memory to the environment that the brain lives in, namely the body, right? So the brain sort of lives in the environment of the body. I think it's an interesting parallel.
Absolutely. And, I always think about when, the memory, you tie a string around your finger to remember something, right? You don't even know what it is you're supposed to remember. It was just something, right? And I think this is exactly what you're saying. Imagine if people have like tense in their shoulders or something like that. It's like, what does that mean? That means your emotional state is sort of manifesting itself in your muscle conditions, your muscle tone. You think, well, why? So that you know that you've been upset, right? Like, and it's just like the string around your finger. Your brain has to know what it was thinking some previous state. And so putting, a funny feeling in your stomach is a mechanism such that a few seconds later, you can still remember that funny feeling, and then that can influence your state. So I think that's fascinating. I don't think we know how all that works in all of these different biological systems. What's so fun about complex systems, right? It almost feels like professional industrial espionage. And what I mean by that is you get to take an idea from one field, like ant population dynamics, and then steal it and take it over to a completely seemingly unrelated field, like cybersecurity on a network, or how the immune system or how memories form in the hippocampus. And you think, well, wait, this idea came from ants. That's not fair. But we can do just that. So we can go into this, let's see, turtle shapes editor, and we can change the shape of that little ant. And we can say, well, let's just pretend like that's a person and they're carrying ideas around. Or let's pretend like that's a wild genetic type of a new type of wheat, and we're putting that in the fields, and we want to know how that spreads. Let's pretend like this is a shipping, and we want to know if this is the right optimal route to take our cargo. Let's pretend like these are sea turtles, and they're trying to find the best beach to lay their nest and such. So we can kind of, that's this sort of stealing one idea and bringing it to the other. And surprisingly, science just hasn't done that as much as it should have or could have. Science is this sort of division into narrower and narrower fields. And I think the opportunity now, as young students, is to go in the other direction, to start combining these kind of things. Okay, so there's another one that we can flip to real quick. Let's see. So to remind you, what we can do is we can go to this models library, and we can look through here. There's another one that's really good. Let's pull back up flocking to remember what we were looking at. And so here we have these little agents. So we're going to simulate this one in Python as well, which is to show you what we were looking at. You know, we want to see these emergent properties, right? So if I have a bird of one, you know, what is a flock of one? Well, it's like a philosophical kind of thing. I mean, no, is it a flock? No, right? And so we have these properties that are only defined in an ensemble. And I think this is a really subtle, interesting part of science, this idea of emergence, that there are certain fundamental things that are very easy to measure, but only when you have a bunch of things. So if we have a single water molecule, for example, and we want to measure its temperature, it doesn't make any sense. A single water molecule has no well-defined temperature. We could think of a water as existing as a solid, liquid, or gas. Well, again, a single HCl molecule has no well-defined phase. It makes no physical sense to say whether one molecule is a solid, liquid, or gas. And so we're going to look at these kind of properties and say, where do they come from? You know, what is that? And so we'll kind of see where these emerge from. Is there anybody who had a chance over the weekend to look through some of these and find any ones of particular interest? Nobody? Let's see. Let me see if there's some fun ones here. This is one I kind of like, called honeycomb, right? How do bees make their house? So here's some that are doing sort of what seemingly looks like random walks, and they're going to converge and they're going to agree upon a honeycomb structure. So honeycombs are interesting because we have this sort of network of sort of empty spots and connected spots. And so that's what we're going to look at next with this really nice, beautiful theory called percolation theory. And so we're going to put NetLogo aside for a second, and then we're going to come back to that. But I want to switch over and think, you know, how do we build one of these network type models, not for the honeycomb, but just an even simpler experiment. So I'm going to go over to our GitHub, GitHub account, and I'm going to scroll down here to our notebooks. And let's pull up this one here that says percolation. So I think percolation is a really nice theory. It's one of those things that's so simple, but yet it has a lot of applications, and it's a sort of a good metaphor or example of a lot of other really interesting stuff that we're going to want to kind of keep track of. This one's called percolation. So let me go back. We were just at the complex systems, the GitHub, and if we go down to notebooks, we find one that says percolation.
Not seeing it in mine.
Just try to refresh. It should be on because I'm on the website here.
Oh,
Go on the bottom below notebooks.
I got it now. I just needed to refresh.
Okay, so there's a few different fun ways to think about what this problem is. One of them would be if we have something like a brick, and we take that brick and we drop it into a bucket of ink, right? And we let it sit there for a month or two, right? And so this brick was originally, you know, like a white brick, and now we're going to drop it into this dark blue ink, and we're going to let it sit there for a month or so. And then we're going to take the brick out, we're going to crack it in half, and we're going to ask, did the ink get to the middle of the brick? Did it soak into the middle of the brick? Right? So you can imagine if it's a spongy type brick, well, yeah, if it's like an actual kitchen sponge, the ink will go right through the middle. If it was some sort of glass block that was impervious to liquid at all, not one drop of ink would get to the middle. And so basically, we want to know how porous of a structure is, and can you pour water through it? And so we're going to look at this in terms of random numbers. So there's another sort of analogy that we can think of this, and that's with electricity. So imagine we have a sort of a fish tank. I think I can switch to this board. How does that work? Yeah, I can switch to that board. Let's see what color shows up on the screen the best. Red, probably. So we're looking at this percolation theory, and I want to just kind of give you a model in your head of what this is going to look like. So you can think of as does the middle of this brick get wet? Let me take a picture of this. And another way to think about this is sort of in terms of electricity. Let me know if remotely you can't see this. I'll describe it as we go. So imagine you have an aquarium, right? So some sort of aquarium type tank like this, some sort of box. And in this box, you're going to put, you know, like the jumper cables in your car kind of thing? You're going to put electrodes. So you're going to put, let's put a plus electrode here, and let's put a minus electrode there. And we're going to hook it in right to the edge of the box. Then what we're going to do is we're going to fill this box with marbles. We're going to fill this box with marbles, but we have two kinds of marbles. We'll have a glass marble that I'll draw as clear, and then we'll have a copper marble that I'll draw as filled in. We'll say that's a metal. And what we're going to do is we're going to fill this thing. I'll make them giant so I don't have to draw as many. If I fill this all with glass, and so I have this glass fish tank with glass marbles in it, and I hook these two electrical electrodes to it, and I try to send a current through it. How much current will I get? None. I won't get any current because this thing is all glass. If I did it the opposite and I made them all copper, and I filled them all in with copper, what's the chance that we're going to get electricity going through it? Well, it's basically going to be 100% because it's just a big tank of metal that it can go through. So what we're going to be interested in is what's the ratio of glass and metal such that we would expect this thing to percolate, as it were, to go through and connect. So do we get some sort of mixture if we had down in here glass along with these metal? You can imagine it sort of might be able to find a path through the metal, avoiding the glass and make its way. And so we would say that's percolated through. You can imagine, again, if there's another example, right, like with oil or water, we could have some sort of porous rock layer, or let's just say this is like some spongy rock material. I'm just going to draw some abstract rock-looking substance. So this is just some porous rock, and then you're going to have some, some water layers, or you're going to have oil or something like that, and you're going to want to know, is the oil in the water, can it permeate this boundary layer, right? And then you can go get a job as a petroleum engineer or something like that. So that's what we're going to be kind of looking at is, I guess I can leave it over there so you can see it. So we're going to be looking at this problem of, percolation. So let's take a look at that. So we're going to, I don't think we need pi plot, but I'm going to leave that there. Oh, I think I need that for random. Okay, so let's just jump in with a couple imports, just like we're always going to do. Don't worry about those details. That's just going to get us the framework to get started. So I've woken up my notebook. I've run the first set of commands, and that's just going to bring in sort of the vocab that we're going to use. Don't worry if all of this stuff is still kind of brand new and strange. We're going to go over it again and again in lots of detail. You're not going to get hit over the head if you can't remember the spellings. It's just sort of, learning how to work with these ideas. And by the end, you'll see there's a common thread to all of these, and it's not going to be as crazy as it seems in the beginning. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set the length, the scale of our little world. So we decide that we're going to make it anything we want. So let's make a little world 20 by 20. Then what we're going to do is we're going to set a threshold, or sort of a probability. We're going to draw these marbles out of a hat, and we want to know what's the probability that on any one pull we're going to pull a glass one versus we're going to pull a marble, metal. So what we're going to do is we're going to make up a random number between 0 and 1. So what I like to do with this kind of code is I like to add blocks in between to kind of remind myself, well, what do these pieces actually do? And this is really, I think, the power of this interactive computing in Jupyter, is that you can run one little command at a time to see what it actually does. So to remind ourselves what random.random does, it just makes up one number every time you call it. It's going to give you back a new number. It'll never be less than 0, and it'll never be bigger than 1. And so what we've done is with random.random, we can tell it to give us a bunch of those numbers at once. If we put in parentheses, say 2 by 2, it'll give us a small little 4 by 4 matrix. What we then want to do is I want binary numbers. I want numbers either 0 or 1. So what we can do is we simply just test these numbers to see if they're less than the threshold. And then the way it works is we'll then get approximately half of them will be. So if we take that and we say, is that less than 0.5? We can think of the less than as sort of asking a question. It's saying, where is that true? And it will return back a matrix telling us where that's going to be true. And it was true in these locations, but not in that one. So in that fashion, we're going to make a random checkerboard. And so there we have our random image. It's 20 by 20. Now, just for fun, we want to think, well, how many images are there of that type? Right? Like, how many? Can I print them all out? For those of you who know me, this is my favorite thing. I'm an enthusiast for these types of pictures, and I just want every possible one I could get. Well, how many possibilities do we have? Well, so let's assume that each one is in 2 states. It can either be 0 or 1. So we get 2 states. And so the first pixel can be in 2 states, but the second pixel can be in 2 states, and they don't depend on the first. So we get 2 times 2, and the second one, and so on. And so we're going to get an equation that's going to be 2 raised to the power however many pixels we have. And how many pixels do we have? L squared, right? So we have this square, L on the side. So we're going to get 2 raised to the L to the 2, which is a gigantic number. It's a gigantic number. So Pokemon style, I cannot collect them all, right? It doesn't matter how much of an enthusiast you are. If you really like pictures of this type, you would know where you couldn't even dent the collection. Maybe that's more exciting. You have super rare ones or something. I don't know. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to look in general when we sort of create one of these random checkerboards, given the probability, right? So we can change P. So let's go up here and make P, oops, let me scroll here. So we had this P as being some small number, 0.5, and say, what's the chance you're less than that? Well, half of them were less than that because they're drawn uniformly. But let's say, what's the chance you're less than 0.1? Well, that's going to be much smaller. So now we have a much fewer number of these turned on. We could make it even smaller fraction and so on. So we can see we can simulate these probabilities very easily this way. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to look with a tool here that will allow us to actually measure these little chunks. So we can think of this as a graph, and we can call these connected components. And so let me go back and change the p-value back to 0.5. Now, again, with all of this code, right, you want you to pay attention and have fun with it now, but you're going to have to go through and run this stuff later, right? It takes a lot of time to kind of run this code and read this code. It takes a lot longer to write this code than it does to go through it. So if it seems like we're going fast, the idea is that you've got to go back through later and rerun it on your own and think, what does it actually do? And I have the tendency to write rather cryptic code, right? And so it's sort of mysterious about what it is it's supposed to be doing. Your job is sort of to decipher the code. So put in here in comments using the hashtag and say, in this line of code, here we are going to take and plot it out. And so that's why you want to have lots of English. I've found that when I'm presenting the code, if I have too many comments, then it gets confusing for you back at the other side of the screen, because then all of the symbols aren't code. And so I tend to only show you functioning symbols, but in general, you don't want your code to look that way. I was just looking yesterday at some code I hadn't looked at in about a year, and it took me about 20 minutes or so to remember what I had written. Okay, so let's not worry about the details, right now where this stuff comes from. This is just going to be, let me run this again. This is some built-in program that Python can make access to that will actually color all of the different chunks. So what it's doing is it's calculating a connected component. So what you would think, and so we're going to look at this idea of a fill tool. So when you go into Microsoft Paint, well, let's just turn that on. That's easy enough to show you. Okay, so when we go into Paint, we can let's draw a sort of, no, that's not the one I want. Where's the, no, that's not the one I want. Let me just draw sort of a random shape like that. Did I connect them? Let's see. And now I can take the fill tool, and if I go in here with the fill tool and hit the middle, boom, it sort of fills that out. So we're going to model that mathematically, and we're going to use that operation to figure out whether or not our pieces are actually percolating and connecting. So this little bit of code is going to show us the connected components. And then what we can do is we can run this. So we're using this program measurements.sum. Don't worry about the details of this part for right now. And it's just going to give us back the area of how big each little cluster is. And then we're going to color code them based on the size of the cluster. Okay, so what we can see when we run this a bunch of times, so let me go back up and look, I made a loop here. So what we're going to do is we're going to make the world bigger. We're going to make it 100 on the side. We're going to loop through a lot of different values. These are just randomly chosen values for this threshold P. So 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, 0.41, so it's not even or anything. It's then going to create a random world of that size. It's then going to go through a loop. We're going to loop through this however many times we've given it to test. So we can do this experiment. This is really the power of these sort of numerical experiments. And then we're going to say, take the current value of P from this vector of different possible values, get the ith one, store it in location P. Now test for all of your random numbers you generated, test whether or not they're less than the threshold. Store that in this matrix M. And then what this code is going to do, the measurements code is going to measure the area and plot the color based on the area. Oh, okay. Am I too much in the way? Point over here.
You're not.
Thank you. Okay, so hopefully you could have seen that from home. Here we have our list of the vectors we're going to sweep through. We're going to make a loop to go through all of those possible values. We'll take them one at a time, set that as our threshold, make our matrix binary, and then this is going to measure the area so that we can see them in color. And so then what we're going to see here is when we have the threshold really low at 0.2, the pieces are really small. You don't get any big clusters, right? Basically, you get little islands surrounded by oceans. You do not get any archipelago or whatever. I know those are still separate, right? Okay, so if we increase this, let me change the size here so we can see this a little better. Okay, so as we increase this probability, what we can see is we're getting larger and larger clusters, right? It's interesting, they almost look like little proteins or something kind of forming. And so if we sweep up through now 0.4, so the chance of this being a plus or 1 was 0.41. If we increase that just a little bit, 0.43, now we go up to 0.5. Now, suddenly somewhere between 0.5, we can still have little islands. Then somewhere between this 0.6, we get this sort of global spanning cluster. We get this one group that's all connected, and then we'll take over the whole thing. That's this idea of percolation. That the water actually goes through the whole layer, in a sense, right? You could think of, if I connect my electricity up here to the yellow, and I connect down here to the other piece of the yellow, it can find a path like lightning and actually get through. So this would be a good model for things like lightning. It would also be a good idea for things like ideas spreading around, contagions. You could look at all kinds of different models. So here we can see that as we increase this value, we get almost with certainty, with like probability 1, that we're going to get this sort of global cluster kind of effect. Okay, so what we're going to want to do is kind of map through that and do an experiment where we can look at that at a bunch of different values and make a plot. So we're going to first take a quick detour, and because we're going to want to figure out if this actually connects, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to pretend like we don't know whether or not it touches the top or bottom, and we're going to use a forest fire model. And so we're actually going to take a simulation that we're going to look at later in detail, but we're going to look at it right now is we're going to basically pretend like these are matches or forest fires, trees, and we're going to set them on fire. And then we're going to watch, does the fire spread to the other side? And so this is a really fun model by itself about, sort of the health of forests. And so you do sort of, controlled burnings and things like this. I grew up in South Jersey, and there we have the Pine Barren. So it's these massive stretches of pine forest. And what they do is they dig fire trails. And so they'll go in with either by hand in small places with just volunteers with shovels, or they'll build like a backhoe. And you'll basically make a gap in the forest. You'll make a sort of a road 20 feet across that doesn't have any trees in it. Okay, so let me zoom in on this. So we're going to kind of tease an idea now today called convolution. We're going to go into a lot of detail about it this semester. But right now, we're just going to use it as sort of a counting mechanism. Okay, so first we're going to start our forest fire simulation. And we're going to start that with a couple of probabilities. First, we're going to have a probability that any one patch is going to get struck by lightning. And then we're going to have the probability that a new tree sprouts on a patch at any one time. Okay, now, what we're going to do is we're going to create a world, just like we did before. We're going to create a 100 by 100 world, and we're going to test whether or not it's greater than a half. So we'll set p equal to 1/2, and then we'll make it an integer. And so that's going to do the same thing we did before. It'll just make this sort of coin flip world. Now, we're going to go in much detail later, but for right now, we're going to use this little filter for convolution. And what this is going to do is it's going to count your neighbors. And so you can think of this 0 represents yourself. This is your neighbor to the left, your neighbor to the right. This is your neighbor above, the neighbor below, up and to the left, and so on. And so this is going to count the neighbors. Each one gets weighted by 1. And it's basically going to give us a way of saying, are there any squares around you that are on fire? And if you have any squares near you that are on fire, and you're a log, then you should catch on fire. So we're gonna run this 1,000 times. We're gonna create. I want to animate this whole thing. So we're gonna save for capital A in animation. And I don't know if we've looked at Torch yet. Torch is just another version of NumPy that allows us to use another chip in the computer called the graphics card. So we'll come back to that. For right now, it's just the same as we've looked at before. And so this is going to make a 100 by 100 space of memory, but it's going to make it 1,000 times. Am I getting a question or there's a ding happening? I think that was way back. Oh, thank you for your comments, Ray, though. I just saw them now. Yeah.
So this is saying, you have a 50% chance of being blocked.
Yes,
And like it's seeing a lot around.
exactly.
But like there's no third dimensional aspect, like in a forest fire. There are trees.
Yeah, so these are almost like frustratingly simple like worlds, right? They don't represent anything.
You can make it.
Well, we could, and I think that'd be really interesting. But then, so then you have to think about like what are the assumptions of the forest, and so do the forest fires spread from canopy to canopy? I don't know. I would kind of imagine that they would, in a sense, right? And so yeah, I think it really gets at these are really just like sort of little mathematical worlds that just happen to do something interesting and vaguely resemble some other aspect of the real world. Yes, you're going to see it. You're going to see it sweeping through, it sort of burns down this forest. So that's what's really fascinating about a model. I think one of the things, the question I like is that models have as few details as possible, while simulations have as many details as possible. So if we wanted to simulate a forest fire, that's something we might be able to do in like in a Unity environment where we actually have branches and they have leaves, and then we can model like the flash point of a leaf, and but it gets complicated, right? Because then you have to think, well, are we getting the wind correct? And what if it's a pine tree in North Carolina? They have this stuff called fatwood, and it's wood that's been sitting there, and sort of the oils in it have concentrated over decades, and they call it lighter wood, and you can just you just take a light to it, and it's like a torch. It's amazing, right? And so you have to add that into the model, right? And so you have the different I was watching a really cool documentary about cooking a few hundred years ago, and they were saying that depending on the temperature you wanted your oven, you would use different kinds of wood. And I thought that was really interesting. Now we just set the daub, and they would actually put different species in there. But that would mean during a forest fire, you'd have to know this species of wood burns at 1200 degrees, but this one burns at 900, and so on.
Yeah, it's just interesting that would be very specific to the model. We're trying to include a lot of branches.
Right.
But it's not.
Well, I think that's what's also really exciting to, just to be as researchers in this field, is that's like an obvious thing you can try. It's like, what would a 3D matrix, what would that look like? Okay, so we're going to store, this is just code to get our world is in W. F is our little filter that's going to count our neighbors. This code is just going to get it ready to run on the graphics card, which we're going to go through later. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to take this world, and we're going to say, first, find out all of the things that are equal to a 1. So what we've done here is we sort of have 3 codes. And again, don't stress if like this doesn't make sense the first go, right? Because I had to look at this many times, and I think as we look at this throughout the semester, it'll start to make a lot of sense, and it's actually a lot of fun, I think. Okay, so we have three codes. We're going to use 0 to means there's nothing there. 1 means it's something there is on fire. And 2 green means it's something that can burn, what we're calling logs, something that can catch on fire. Okay, so first we're going to say who's on fire. And the way we do that is we say, hey, world, where are you equal to a 1? And that will be all the places in the world that are on fire right now. And we'll store that as n. Then what we're going to do is we're going to run this step, conv2, which we're going to come back to later. But this is just going to count your neighbors. So this one is going to count your neighbors, and n is how many neighbors are on fire. Right? So n, after you've done these first steps, first you say, hey, everybody, are you on fire? True or false? And you put up a true if you're a 1, so that you're on fire. And then this is going to do a counting. We're going to go back and look at how that works later. This will count and say, around me there were 3 people on fire, or there were no people on fire. And so n is going to be a matrix. This is what's kind of cool about this different kind of programming, right? We're gonna use these math operations rather than traditional code. So n is a whole, it's the size of W still, right? So it's this whole big matrix. Okay, now what we're going to do, and this is kind of, it takes a second to decompress, sort of how I've written this code. I would encourage you to kind of rewrite it into some different terms, but I like to emphasize the code this way. So what we're going to do is first we're going to say, let's look at the first line here. So first we're going to say, world, where are you at 2? And that means you're a log, you're a green log. wherever you were a 2, that's going to return a true. So wherever this is true, we want you to stay a log. If you're a log, just stay that way. So if you are 2, become a 2. And so wherever you're a 2, that will be a true. We multiply a true, which is the same thing as multiplying by 1. We multiply it by 2. And so we just replace this self with a 2. So we can think of that as like a fixed point. If you are a 2, you stay a 2. The next line we're going to do is we're going to subtract if your neighbors, if n is your personal neighbor count. So everyone has their own neighbor count. If your neighbor count is bigger than 0, that means one of your neighbors is on fire. So if one of your neighbors are on fire, and, so we're going to think of the multiplication as an and operator, and you were a green log. So W equals 2 means you were a 2, and your neighbors, or some one of your neighbors are on fire. So we're going to do lots of examples like this in different simulations. So don't worry if this is all new. So the first two things, the first one say, if you're a 2, stay a 2. But if you were a 2 and your neighbor was greater than 0, we want to subtract. Yeah.
Could you possibly show it on the computer screen so
Yeah.
we can follow along, because we can't.
Okay, if I do like this, is that better?
Yeah, that'd be better. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for letting me know. Okay, so the first line here, it's going to say, hey, where in the world, let me know where you're a 2. So we test, we say, are you equal to a 2? So this will come back as a whole matrix of true and false. And then wherever that was true, we wanted to just replace it with a 2. Now, if you were a 2, but one of your neighbors was bigger than 0, then what you're going to want to do is you're going to actually take 1 away, and you're going to set yourself on fire. So to be a green log is 2. So if you subtract 1, you're now on fire. Right? So it's an interesting way to think, to use these numbers to represent these things we want to simulate. And then once your fire is gone, you're empty, and you're just an empty spot. So we have these 4 terms here. So this is kind of a funny way to write code. We can break this down next time in some pieces. What I've done here is this is one giant line. So we have this character extender here, which is going to say that this is all like a line rag. So we could write this all out as one big thing, but I like to line it up this way. And then we have a minus sign, and a plus sign, you want to notice. And so W is going to be the sum of all of these things. And yeah. Oh, sorry. Remind me to point on here. Yeah.
You have there on the second line.
Yeah.
N is there. What if N is 2? And that's just your log.
So N in this case, so it's not asking if W is equal to 2. It's asking if N, which we did this step, which made N the neighbor count. So this step here is making N the neighbor count.
So it's just 0.
Yes. Yes, it'll be if any of your neighbors are on fire, then that will be a 1. So we're doing this subtle thing where we're using true and false like 0 and 1. And so we get to kind of do this math on the logic, which is kind of fun. And then I'll show you next we can go through and I'll show you how you can rewrite this code. So the first piece says if you're a 2, stay a 2. If you're a 2 but your neighbor was greater than 0, then you subtract 1. And you think, well, why is it a 1? Well, there's just sort of an implicit 1 out front here, right? So I could put 1 times, and that would be the same. And then the next part is going to be, did you get struck by lightning? So we're going to, for each possible square, we're going to make up your own random number, again, 1 for every possible square. So you can imagine you just live as a square. And then you have some chance of lightning. That's a very small number. So you're going to make up a random number between 0 and 1, and then you're going to ask what's the chance that's smaller than that. So if you're making up numbers between 0 and 1, it's not very likely it's going to be less than that, because that's a small number, but it does happen. And if that does happen, so if this thing comes back true, for every spot that it comes back true, and you were green, you've now subtract 1, which means you set on fire. So we're doing lots of things in parallel, and this is, again, so we're going to go through this stuff over and over again in lots of different versions. So this is kind of like a first go. But we're going to do lots of things in sort of parallel, which is kind of a really fun way to think, and it's going to really help us once we scale to things like in Unity. So we're going to subtract 1. So if you got hit by lightning, we subtract 1 from your state, and now you're on fire. And now we're going to do something very similar. We're going to say, if your value was less than this probability of growth, then you're going to sprout a tree. And so what that means is if you were empty, if the world was empty, and this tree happened to sprout on your square, then you add 2 to your spot, which made the empty 0 into a 2. So we have this probability of growth is going to be some small chance. If that comes back true for your square that you're in, then what you do, if your square was empty, you then add 2 to that square. So now you've sprouted a new tree in that spot. Okay, so let's run this. It's not as complicated as the code looks, and we can rewrite this code in a different way. You want to have an aesthetic and a style that you like with writing the code. You don't have to have the same one I have. You just want to develop one. The way I learned how to write code is I take it and I say, oh, that's ugly, and I rewrite it. You should take my code and say, that's ugly, and rewrite it. Or you can like my code. It's cool too. Okay, so when we run this, I'm still continuously impressed with this model. I think this is the coolest thing. So let me make this a little bigger so we can see the whole thing. Zoom out a little bit here. Okay, so it's running. This is on a loop now. So this is an animation running on a loop. It's 10 seconds long, and then it will repeat. And what it's doing is it starts out empty, and then the forest starts to grow. So it starts as empty field, and this is the rate that the trees are showing up. And then the rare event of the lightning strikes in red. And then if there's a neighbor that happens to be a tree, then you get this forest fire that takes off. Let's run it again and get a different example.
Is this like on like a donut? Or does this have borders?
This one is not on a donut, I don't.
No.
Yeah, no, I didn't wrap this one. So the question is like, do the conditions wrap? And if you look, there's like a solid white band of trees. No, the conditions don't wrap on this. We can. That's a great thing though, and we can add that. It's how you define the conv2. If we padded that one, so if we change this one, we can get that to wrap around. So in general, this would just be like it's on an island. Let's simulate, right? And so it's on an island, so the fire can't get off the island. But I think it's just really fascinating to see that kind of like almost lifelike behavior of that wave front. So now this is actually a model for a lot of different things, right? So now we have these kind of waves in our brain, in our retina, in our heart. I would imagine, probably just gamble to say almost any other system you could think of. Peristaltic waves. We have these kinds of these waves throughout our whole system that operate our whole body. And so this is a really good example of what's called excitable media. Excitable media. That each one of these is sort of ready to be set on fire, and it's there, and then they can kind of reset themselves. So I'm going to post there's a really great classic documentary called Never Say Never, and they built like in the 70s, they built these out of fire. And so they would get little candles, and they made them out of the special asbestos wick, such that the candle would burn, but then it would put itself out. It was sort of a self-extinguishing candle, and then after a few minutes, it would be able to light itself again. So you'll see that in the documentary, and I think this is a really cool kind of model of that. Okay, so that's this forest fire simulation. I think it'd be fascinating to extend that to 3D. Just watch it. And then you have to ask, like a 3D version of this might not necessarily simulate a forest more realistically, but it simulates something more realistic, or something. Okay, so that's our forest fire model. Again, don't worry about like this is fun, and we're going to go through and look at a lot of different models that do that the same way. So don't be worried if that was like kind of very strange. Okay, now we can use that code now though to test our percolation. And so let's go back up here and look at this code. Let me zoom in. So now we're going to combine those two experiments, our percolation experiment, and we're going to combine our forest fire experiment. So we'll make a world, point here, we'll make a world that's 50 by 50. We'll set the percolation threshold at 0.48. We'll set the world randomly. We'll turn them into zeros and ones. I set the edges of the world here, just so we kind of have it in like a box. We're going to do the same thing with the burning, but I'm going to multiply by a 2 in the beginning, so all these things become like a 4, which is not defined in the model, so they just stay there. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to start the world randomly, and then this is the key spot here. We're going to turn on 1. We're going to sort of set the middle of the world on fire. Set a middle. right? So we're gonna turn. They're all gonna be basically zeros. Sorry, they're all gonna be twos. They're all gonna be twos and zeros, right? Because we're simulating the wood, and we're gonna set one on fire, and we want to know, does it percolate to the edges, basically? Does it percolate to the edges? So if we run this, here it's spitting them out one at a time. Okay, so if we see we have one square that's orange in the middle, and if we run that, we can see that goes out to two squares, and then we get a little bit of a wave front here, and then that's going to go out randomly in these different directions. And the question is that going to hit the sides? Well, it depends on what that value for the percolation value, right? So if we set this, if we leave it in the right spot in the screen, it'll kind of animate it for you. If you don't move the mouse while it runs, you'll get sort of an animation like that. And we can see at that percolation value, we do get it. So what we're going to want to do now is we're going to look at, for a given percolation value, or for a given value, probability value, do we expect this to percolate or not? This is just some code to set the edges. So here I set, these are the areas that represent the four walls. So these are just the four walls, and I just set up a simple thing to say, if any of these are on fire, then you've breached the walls, right? If the thing next to the walls are on fire, we're going to stop and end the simulation. Yes, for that definition to percolate, yes. In general, I'm just saying, does it reach one of the sides from the? Because you can imagine, like, if it was the brick, the ink could get in that side or something. Right? In general, we're just going to use this as an example to figure out, what's this relationship between our chance that we're going to percolate. So when we had if our ratio is 0, we have no copper, right? We're going to get no percolation, right? It's 0% of the buckets that have entirely glass are going to percolate. So we'll be down here. When we have entirely 100% copper, we're going to get they'll all connect to one. So the question is, and so it has a behavior like this. And the question is, what do we expect, in this region? What do we expect to happen there? Okay, that's fine. Okay, so now we're going to set this whole thing up as sort of an experiment. So we do this 100 world. We'll set the edges. Let's set this thing, and then what we're going to do is I've made this thing. These are just the edge wall, so you can verify later that these areas represent the walls. Oh yeah, thank you. I should just point on here anyway. So this is going to represent the edges of the walls. If any of the edges are on fire, we will stop the simulation. We'll do a break and we'll print the word percolation. If that's not true and nothing else is on fire, right? If there's nothing else lit on fire anymore, then we'd say no percolation. Okay, and so if we run that for a little bit, it'll stop and said no percolation. It didn't get through. Let's run it again. And that one, it looks like it's gonna, well, I don't know. See, it's gonna die out. No percolation. Okay, so that one died out, and that was for threshold 3.7. So if we make that, for example, 5.7 and run it again. Okay, so that's a good question. So let's find out. So let's make a plot. So what we're going to do is we're going to define this whole experiment. So we're going to do 100 different values for P. So let's test all the way from 0 all the way up to 1, and then we'll test each possible value. And so for each value of the experiment, we're gonna run it, and then we're gonna see do you percolate or no percolate. And so let's run that, and we can see that we get. Let's scroll through the list here. And we can see in the beginning, it got no percolations, and then suddenly it sort of started to switch, and they all percolate. So if we run that as the output, we got something like this, that for the first 20 runs, they were all 0. For the last 20 ones, they were all 1, and then somewhere it sort of switched, but then it sort of went back and forth at some point. If we put the lines in there like this, we could see that it was not monotonic. It sort of went backwards at some point. Okay, so now let's do this 1,000 times and average the experiment. Okay, so what we can do is let's do that experiment we just did 500 times. So let's go ahead and start that running. Let's give that a second to run. And if we, you want to wait? I've got the cake in the oven, right? It's like a cooking show. You put one cake in the oven and then you open up the second oven. All right, so in the second oven here, we have all 500 trials plotted there. And we get this roughly the same behavior. And then what we can do is we can average. And I think this is really extraordinary. So the plot that you're going to get, I want you to replicate tonight, is that we're going to have an average over all the rows of this experiment and then divide by how many experiments we ran, 500. And so we'll get the fraction that percolated or not percolated for the given value. And this is really interesting. This is cooler than it looks because this is something that we call phase transition. Because when you think of a lot of things in nature, they're either happening or they're not. When you think about water boiling, it's either boiling or it's not, right? There's no such thing as, well, it's cooking and simmering and all that. I guess it's complicated. But let's just say there's boiling and not boiling, right? And so when does boiling happen? Well, if you have your water at, 90 degrees C, it's not boiling. If you have your water at 98 degrees C, it's not boiling. And then suddenly, boom, it switches up to boiling. And from any temperature hotter than that, it's going to be boiling. So I think this percolation is a beautiful theory, and that's very simple. We've gone kind of through the whole theory in a sense. And yet it gives us an example of, we have, on light switches, we have two kinds of switches. We have the dimmer switches, and we have the regular light switches on or off. What this is showing us is that we have a dimmer switch, and we turn and turn, nothing's happening, boom, the lights turn on. So we get this situation where we smoothly continued one variable, this is the dimmer switch down here, and then boom, it's just like there's very little, that's a very quick kind of transition, right? Now the interesting thing is if you want to go and look, the math of this is this number dependent on the fact that it's a square grid? What if we did a triangular mesh, or what if we did it in 3D, right? Would percolation in 3D work differently? And what would percolation in some other higher dimension kind of stuff kind of look like? So I think this phase transition is really interesting. I think it's really at the heart of a lot of almost all technology in general. I'm fascinated by it because it goes back to the steam engine, right? The original steam engine is where sort of all electricity that's generated on the planet, other than photo cells, other than solar panels, is really generated by creating steam. Which steam is this really wacky thing where if you think about how much space that water needs, that if I take this little bit of water at this temperature, can they see me? Yeah. At this temperature, it needs this much space. If I were to take this water and change the temperature, for some reason, it suddenly needs more space as steam. And it will move a steam engine along the way to do that. And I think that's really extraordinary. And it's this idea of a phase transition. So we see phase transitions all the time in biology and in physics. And I think this is like a really, really simple kind of math model for that. Can anybody think of some other kind of phase transitions that you might see in general? What's something that you smoothly change the one thing and then suddenly something happens? Yeah, that's a great example, right? Exactly. You'd have a sort of a sub-threshold current stimulation. Sort of nothing's happening, it's below threshold, and then suddenly just a couple more millivolts. Now I'm going to be stochastic, right? We had to average this many times, but on average you would expect boom, and then now the neuron fires. Yeah, it's a fantastic example. And so we can think of the neuron itself as sort of sitting at this. It wants to be right at that boiling point in a sense, right?
I think almost. Sorry to interrupt. I'll say that almost anything in nature has this kind of phase transition. So if you think you're applying pressure to a wooden board, you're applying pressure, and then suddenly it breaks. You can think of that as a phase transition model. Or if you take a rubber band, you stretch it, nothing is happening, and then you reach that stage where it breaks, and it breaks the law of elasticity, it becomes more plastic. All that sorts of thing happens with almost everything in nature. There's a breaking point that happens.
Exactly. So yeah. So over the weekend, everybody tried to think of some phase changes, whether it's in your own research or something you just witnessed. Maybe it's in markets, in sort of economies. How about that? Where suddenly there's an excitement level, and then suddenly, everyone's going, I've heard about Bitcoin. I've heard. Oh no, I gotta buy one. That might work something like that, where you get ideas that sort of go from. Yeah. Yeah, there's a chance, sometimes it percolated, for some of these lower values.
And then just luck with the orientation works a certain way.
Yeah, it just has to do with the fact that this is sort of a statistical theory, and that one pattern, right? You think of this one forest or this one game board might have just for some peculiar reason had a nice convenient path where like you could have gotten lucky and made sort of a streamer of connections, where in general at that probability level you wouldn't get that connection, right? So I think in terms of like brain activity, right? I like this idea too about just, does it start or stop, right? That if we go back and look at the animation, does one little fire spot lead to 2? Does it lead to 3? Does it die out? So in this kind of a model, we could look at this for, excited neurons or something. But you don't want, the excitation of all the neurons to sweep across your whole cortex, or you'll have a seizure, right? So we have to somehow get it so that ideas are sort of contagious, but not too contagious. Otherwise, it will just like this, it will go all the way across, and we might not be able to pick an idea. Any other thoughts, questions from anybody on the remote?
No, I just remembered another example that you told us in the other class of the garden in Japan that fills with water slowly, and then one drop
Yeah, that's a great example. Yeah, let me see if I can pull that up. Thing is, I don't know how to spell it. It's called the Shishi Odishi. Who thinks they can spell that?
Like a deer stare?
Yeah. There it is. Yeah, so they have one in Murakami. Yeah, Ray actually, Sabosa sent me a video of this recently. I think he was there. Yeah, so this is a fun example of something where you're continuously adding water. So these are to keep the deer from eating your flowers. And so at a seemingly random interval, to us it would be regular, but to a deer it would seem unpredictable. So you sort of have a steady flow rate, and then just when it gets to the tipping point, it just makes that awesome sound. And so this is called a relaxation oscillator, and it is very much of that same character. Great idea. I think it's the same one here. Shortcut it here. There it goes. Yeah, so you can imagine lots of sort of regulatory systems in biology and others. They work in that same kind of feedback, tipping point kind of phenomenon. All right, so I think that'll do it for today. I thank you for your time and attention. This notebook is online. Go through it and run this code. I've recently read that to be a good poet, you have to write 1,000 poems. I think to be a good programmer, you have to write 1,000 programs. We're going to start in this class by probably reading 1,000 programs. So start with this and read through it. It's okay if it doesn't all make sense today. We're going to go through it, and then eventually you're going to rewrite it in your own sort of fashion, which can be in the same version. But I think that's really the thing you want to do. That code is not like literature, right? If you rip off Harry Potter, that what's her name is going to be pretty upset at you. But this is not like that, right? Your job is to rip off this code, rewrite it, steal it, call it your own, and put it on your GitHub and everything else. All right. Let me know if you have any questions. I'll be available online. Have a great weekend. Yeah, we're just going to leave this running because now the other section is going to start in a second.
Where's it be uploaded?
I'm sorry, say again?
Where is this recording going to be uploaded?
That's a good question. I'll have to send out that link. We'll post it on the Canvas.
After, a few hours after, it will be available. And
I have a quick comment to make, and also to get your input on what you think about this cortical structure that Andrew Coward's model was referring to, and its parallel link with the VQ-VAE2 model. So I kind of shared the paper on the chat. If you can pull up the paper, you'll see that there is like this autoencoder library, and then
Hey, that's great and all, but I
There's
just really would like to know where the
a
recording
dictionary
is.
made out
Yeah,
of
sorry.
that dictionary
Hang
that
on a
kind of
second,
fine
Sabosa.
tunes
Sabosa, there was a question about.
the dictionary
Hold
that
up.
it was already looking at. So
Hang
if
on, let me
you
see if I can mute him. Hang on.
scroll down
Thanks.
into the paper,
Ray, hang on a second.
you're going to see that
Delete, you
how
hear me?
the fine tuning helps in selecting very fine grained pixels
Okay, Sabosa, hang on just 1
in
second.
that paper. So it's like on page number 3 in that paper, the first image. Sorry, in page number 4 of the paper, you'll see that the architecture of the.
Thank you.
I muted him. Sorry. I just realized that I had the one who had to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No, I
okay.
went on Canvas on the WebEx catalog, and it says the instructor's still putting something up.
So once the recording
Hey,
is,
Will, I just wanted to ask you and also ask you a suggestion on what do you think
sorry,
of
supposed
this
to real quick, we're
Hang
just,
on, I think you have to mute him,
in
Elon. I don't think I
relation
can.
with the
Did-
cortical column.
Thank you.
so after the session, it's going to be this class plus the following class is going to be a single recording. Once it has made available by WebEx, so WebEx takes a little while to process it, and then we can access it and just send out a link.
Is there any other recordings up there?
Not from this class, no.
Okay, because I keep getting that same page of please wait, your instructor is getting things up and running.
Yeah, that might very well be this recording. It might just be.
Yeah, this would be the first recording.
And the recording for the previous lecture you guys had on, I think it was last Tuesday, during a different time.
We'll post that link. Yeah, so we'll post that link into Canvas as well. That one's currently on a Google Drive. We're going to upload that to probably our YouTube.
The one
and
with
then we'll upload that.
with our speaker, we did record that.
Yeah, so we have both Andrew Coward lectures. We'll also post those links. They'll probably be available in the next day or two.
All right, thank you so much. I
Thanks
appreciate
for the
it.
question.
Thank you.
Maybe I should. All right, let's see. I just requested that he unmute.
Yeah, I don't understand.
Sorry, I think I.
Why, like you.
Hey, unfortunately, I don't think you weren't able to hear. There was another individual who asked a question. We were still responding, and it seemed like you weren't able to hear that we were responding to this other individual. So
Yeah, that's what has happened. Sorry about that. I
We
was
missed
I
a
think I was
good chunk of
talking.
what you were talking about because we were actually trying to.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Oh no, not at all. I'm just letting you know. So in case I don't think we registered.
Yeah, I lost the voice for a bit, and I couldn't hear anything. So.
No problem at all. Just wanted to make sure you had a chance to express what you were talking about, but Will has stepped away, so I don't. Maybe you want to save it. It's probably going to be relevant in the next couple of minutes. And we start the next section. So I'm wondering, so there's folks in the classroom, but given that, video. I know there are folks in the classroom, but given that I'm going to be online, it makes it harder for me to hear you guys. I find that. So I'm wondering if maybe I don't know, maybe it'd be best if folks just dispersed and got on their devices elsewhere, like on a laptop, or even just got on their laptops in the classroom. If you have a laptop.
Elon, I don't know if the room that William's in has it, but I did Neuroscience 1 a few years ago, Neuroscience 1 and 2, and we had mics in the room that would get passed around if a
Oh,
student
no,
was
this room
going to
does have.
talk.
This room does. That's right. I just remembered. Thank you for reminding me. Will, do they have those little desk mics? I don't know if they're hearing me.
Are we still connected? Elon, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you, but were you able to hear me? Okay, this terrible white glare. I don't think you guys can hear me. That seems to be the case. I am not muted. I know everybody online is able to hear me, so that means the AV system there is not on. Misha, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you just fine. We had our microphone muted.
There you go. Do you have those little desk mics that are to the right of the monitor?
Oh, the desk ones? Yeah, we have them on all the desks.
Oh, perfect. Okay, they're already there. Awesome. Okay, I think we'll
Is this working? Test
jump in.
1, 2, 3.
Yep, I can hear you fine. Thank you. Okay, so I hope some of you may have had the opportunity to see our speaker, Andrew Coward, at the neuroscience seminar. If not, we're going to be spending some time on Coward and his model of the brain. And he gave a lecture that was recorded, and we're going to post that lecture for you guys to watch. So that's actually going to be sort of one of our first actual assigned readings, and it's about an hour long lecture, and there's questions you can watch afterwards as well. So we'd like for folks to have a look at that. And another reading that we want to start as soon as we can is Kluge. Can I ask a question? Okay, so there's a book called Kluge, or Klug, depending on who you ask, and it's a really nice read that by a guy named Gary Marcus, and it's sort of a very informal way of looking at, how would you think about thinking about the brain as an evolved system. And so, thinking about the fact that the brain had to be pieced together, kind of almost hodgepodge, based on evolutionary pressures and essentially even accidents of evolution. So it's a really nice kind of broad scale, 50,000 foot level look at some of the kind of questions that we're interested in considering in this class. So I think that's possibly available as PDF, or I think we have to check on that. But if not, it's a very cheap purchase, and so we'd like people to get a hold of that. So we'll post this after today's class. And so I'm going to post the Andrew Coward lecture and then that book. And the expectation is you'll definitely have an opportunity to watch the Andrew Coward lecture before next class. And might post some questions about that, along with maybe some of the other readings that we've already kind of put up there before. Okay, so today, what I want to talk about a little bit is
A quick question.
Yes.
As far as books are concerned, since we're talking about books, is the Andrew Coward, his book that he mentioned, is that available already, or is there a way?
No, I reached out to him about it. He said it's forthcoming. I think it's not has not been published yet.
Oh, okay.
He shared the name of it in the lecture, but I don't think it's available yet.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
But he does have other books, some that are very compelling. They're excellent books that we would strongly recommend. In fact, if I were able to get hands on a digital copy, I would really like to distribute it. The hard copy of that book. So there's a book called Pattern Thinking by the same guy, Andrew Coward, and it's to some extent, it's out of print. It's actually expensive and difficult to get your hands on. It's a very limited run edition of so can't assign that just yet. Maybe might photocopy some of it or something back in graduate school. But there are what is available from Andrew Coward if you're looking for more is first of all the lecture that we're going to post, but also there are a couple of YouTube videos where he lays out really quite similar content that you can watch for some additional material on that. So Andrew Coward and his model, I've been thinking quite a bit about modeling, and that's something that really this class is really fundamentally about, right? Which is we have this idea that we've got now some tools to build artificial intelligence simulations of the brain, and we want to place them into simulated environments, right? So
Hey, Elon, Elon, can you hear me?
Yeah.
The other professor who switched rooms with you, that room's locked. How can we get in there?
Oh crap. I have to go to the secretary.
He's not here.
Wow, that's a disaster. Secretary's not here?
No.
All right, give me a second. Let me email the secretary. Gosh, let me see if there's somebody I can call.
Should I just call security real quick?
Yeah, that's probably the best option, unfortunately.
Okay. I'll work on that.
Thank you. How many folks are down there, do you know?
What?
If only 2 people, maybe we could just put them in a different like 303.
Yeah, I mean, me and I and Matt could move. Can you hear me?
What'd you say, Rachel?
Just the three of us, we can move pretty easily.
Oh, I see. Yeah, perfect. Is that there's only 3 folks right now live?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. In that case, maybe just give her the class now, and I'll have to make arrangements for the future. Hey, Susan, I don't know if you saw, well, we're just dealing with the fact that there's another class that's showing up in the classroom that we were using for this. And so just trying to manage that before we get going.
Oh, great. Hey,
Yeah.
guess what? I just had an hour meeting with Teresa about the sandbox.
Oh, that's awesome. How'd it go?
I think it went well. I think we should talk. We should talk about it
Right after?
like
Who's
after
up?
class. Yeah, you, I, and Will. She's gonna try to talk to Carol.
Good. Well done.
I hope so. I also asked her if we could get a program director or whatever. She wants one too.
She does.
Yeah, and because they're worried about, they don't want students in the sandbox all the time if you have all your bots there and stuff. They've been trying to deal with that.
Okay.
And so I suggested, I'm like, well, yeah, that's why there's a reception desk. We need someone there. And,
Right.
so I worked them for that. Yeah,
We've been fighting for that for a long time.
Yeah,
So.
I think I'm gonna have.
I tried my best and I offered, some of my chair money and I know Michael loves the idea, the Dean of Arts and Letters. Because,
Great.
if we get this person to write grants, right, and like an actual researcher, someone to contribute to the group and the sandbox and the center, that would be awesome.
Alright, I'm gonna stop this.
All right. Yeah. So can you talk right after the class? You can
Of
just.
course. Yeah. Sorry, I'm eating chips.
I think that's a banana. Misha, what's current status? Do you know?
We're gonna migrate. So I'm gonna leave this meeting
First,
and
migrate to some other room together.
Wait, now we're not using this room? No. So they can come in. Yeah.
yeah, we're gonna migrate.
Sorry about that. Sorry about the logistical snafu. Sorry about that.
Migrating. I just want to say that sounds very cool. So thank you, Susan. Thank you, Elon. And if Will can hear me, thank you.
Will, is that you in the 561 number?
Yeah, that's me. I just joined. I'm just listening in. So
Okay. That's not as much fun. All right, let's see. I don't know if I want to wait just a couple more minutes. Truth is, the visuals aren't really important today. They're more as an aid for my own memory. Things I wanted to discuss.
You need to unmute yourself, right? If you're saying something. Hi, Susan. You're muted. You're muted, so we cannot hear you. I can see that you're trying to say something.
Oh, hi. I really like the talk on recommendation architecture.
Yeah, we're going to jump right into that, actually.
Oh, good. Oh, great. Okay.
A little bit, just at a very high level, really, because as a lead into the broader conversation that I kind of wanted to have today about modeling overall, modeling exactly what it would mean to model the brain. So yeah, we're going to post Andrew Carrott's talks. So he actually gave one in the class, and then he gave one as the neuroscience seminar speaker, and we're going to post both of those in the Canvas, so you'll be able to access those. So in case you wanted to rewatch them.
Sorry for that mess up.
Okay, so I think I'm gonna keep going here.
When did Howard originate his recommendation architecture? I noticed he has a book, 2005, but I didn't know if it was in that book.
As far as I know, and Rachel can probably speak to this more efficiently than I. As far as I know, he's been describing the same architecture to a large extent for a long time, but maybe with at different levels of detail.
in the 80s, this architecture came. He started talking about it in the 80s. Pattern thinking is like the first solid iteration of the whole architecture.
Pattern thinking, is that the name of the book?
Yeah, it was published in 1990. I can send you a link and post a link on Canvas. It's kind of hard to get your hands on because it's out of print.
This is very amazing. I mean, I asked him about global workspace. He didn't seem all that familiar with it. But it seems like he might have come first.
I think that's a certainty. I think that he came first. I mean, chronologically speaking, considering how long he's been, as far as publication of these ideas, yeah.
It's weird that he's not more well known.
We're kind of puzzled by this. We're also, curious how it came to be. Somebody, it's really to some extent outside the academy, certainly of neuroscience.
My dog just stole a bunch of nachos. I don't know if you guys saw that.
Seems to have sorted out the brain much more effectively than anybody in the Academy of Neuroscience, and I mean that kind of in the.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say, I thought that he had it right. I mean, that's the crazy part. I mean, I need to think about it in more detail.
It's sort of the thing that's very clear is that he has it worked out. It makes sense to him, and he seems like a really smart guy. So if it makes sense to him, he sort of understands how neurons can actually, from neurons and just those local communications, you can get this whole emergent thing called the brain, and he sort of has the whole picture. I still have a lot of work to do in terms of trying to understand it personally and all its components, but. Yeah, it's very clear that he knows something or has a good understanding of something. You can sort of get at least a high level view of it. Those who have spent more time with it, like Rachel, I think will tell you that it really is an understandable full theory.
Yeah, I think that one of the reasons that maybe he's not as well known is because he wasn't in the academia sector. He was in industry. Right. So if anyone's familiar with Bell Labs, an offshoot of Bell Labs, when they had to stop being a monopoly, was Southern Bell and Nortel Networks, and so he was involved very early in both of those companies. So it could just be like a lot of the work he did was more like industry proprietary, and that's what it sounded like. Because I asked him, kind of like when in the GNTP meeting, I asked him. Like what came of his stuff, because he actually wrote like some pseudocode in the 90s for it, and he said that they just didn't have the type of silicon like processing. They didn't have the type of computers basically that they needed to actually make it worthwhile. So it's kind of interesting that we're coming full circle back around to that.
Yeah, but how intriguing the idea that there's somebody who actually has figured out some, really important stuff about the brain, and yet nobody knows about it, right? He's effectively invisible.
That's so depressing.
It is. It's incredibly depressing in the sense that just from the perspective of, think about this poor lonely man who knows all this, right? And just does, nobody else really he hasn't been able really to share it with a lot of people.
Well, we have knowledge that other people do not because of.
That's correct. That is correct.
Think about how we've seen this before, right? I was watching a talk, and Jan LeCun said as recent as 2011, he submitted a paper to a journal, and they rejected it, saying, "What is a convolutional neural network?" It's 2011, right? And so I think some of these
first round, Jan LeCun invented the convolutional network. So the fact that he's getting
the 1989 version of that, Linnet from AT&T. It's like frustratingly similar to modern architecture, right? It's like upsettingly similar to how it works now.
That's right.
It's actually insane.
So yeah,
the only reason we got AlexNet in 2012 is because people started to pay attention, not because of technology.
Well, how do I feel about Steven Grossberg though?
That's the question. Go on. Sorry.
That's why I'm so curious when Rachel reads Steven Grossberg's papers, because I kind of feel the same way about him. There's so much stuff that he mentioned that Dr. Coward mentioned as well that just doesn't seem to be getting any kind of recognition from either AI or neuroscience. That's kind of puzzling.
I think it's historically. I'm going to disagree a little bit with that. I think that technology does. It leads to a snowball, a phase transition of sorts. And so in the case of neural networks, for example, we'll tell you, ad nauseum that neural networks are not new. People have conceptualized the basic framework probably for over 100 years ago. And people have been working consistently on neural networks and publishing in academic journals consistently throughout the AI winters. There was never really, a time where it was dormant at all. So all this work has been going on, and yet everybody ignored it. And I was told in graduate school, ignore this. It's not going to have any value. It's never going to solve any of the problems that we are really interested in. Susan knows exactly what I'm talking about. I mean, this was her advisor, Jerry Fodor. Spent pretty much an entire semester explaining why connectionism, as they called it, was wrong. And it had a future. And so, there really was an orthodoxy and despite that, there was continued work. So what happened? Why are we all talking about neural networks? Why is the world talking about neural networks? And I think it is because they proved, at least publicly, there was in 2012, there were certain circles, people knew that they were working in industry and who knows where, but it became public knowledge that these things really worked. Then they solved the problem of vision, and that became disseminated. That information was broadly known, and that led to the snowballing that's happened. And now we're seeing much more advances, right? We're seeing there is academic advances, scientific advances, engineering advances happening because it became useful, broadly useful. And so I think that there is really a sort of an intricate relationship there between technological advance and scientific advancement, just to put it in those words. Susan,
I was talking a little more on lines of as far as vision is concerned, for example, as in neural nets, that they solved a problem of static vision, but like motion is still, they still don't really know how to characterize that and how to figure
They're getting better, right?
That's how we see the world. So it's really far still from human vision, since we see things in motion, we don't just see static objects.
To be fair, though, the research that you started working on in our lab actually is trying to process motion, at least body motion, in the form of pose estimation, and then running some models that actually that take the dynamics, or at least the actual sequence of the pose over time. And so that's maybe one way of thinking about how to understand motion, though, and it's much more successful than anything that's come before, right? That's what's nuts about neural networks, is that you can throw them at lots and lots of different problems. It's not that somebody solved the cat and dog problem. We figured out how to sort cats and dogs, guys. It's a big deal. We never were able to do before, but you can't do anything else. No, it's once you solve the cat and dog problem, as we sometimes say, you can solve pretty much any vision problem, and more, right? Not just vision problems. It applies to other kinds of data. So I think that's it's a fair critique to say that sort of the mind, it's the mind of the gaps, right? People use the term the god of the gaps. Well, neural networks can't do this yet, and they probably never will, right? And that's what I heard about in graduate school. They can't. I doubt Jerry Footer had any idea what I don't mean to knock the man, but he probably didn't have a really good idea of what neural networks could do. I doubt he had studied them to the point where he knew that they were employed in the post office, for example, that they were doing real world vision. But what he would point to is, but they can't do language at all, right? They can't do this compositionality problem that he always liked to talk about. If you know that there's something true about it's about brown things, about cows, about brown cows, and he sort of implied that a neural network could never get that compositional idea. He claimed to have proved it. So he was pointing to a specific linguistic trick that humans are able to do, and saying, well, computers can't do that. Neural networks can't do that, so therefore they never will, and therefore there's something. It's the wrong direction, right? That was generally the message you would get.
It's weird because he sort of was very old by the time deep learning started to take off and succeed, so I never did get to talk to him.
Yeah.
About all this.
Because he wouldn't have gone to see GPT-3, and even if he had seen GPT-3, he would have still said, "Well, let's see it actually." Perform compositionality, we have to come up with a test for it.
Yeah, well,
it's a fun challenge right there. Let's see if maybe GPT-3 could, maybe we could demonstrate that it can actually solve the problem of compositionality.
Yeah, so the kind of arguments made by Gary Marcus are the kind of arguments that Jerry made. And after GPT-3 came out, Gary Marcus did a really nice piece in the MIT Technology Review. I recommend it to everybody very strongly, about the problems with GPT-3 and causal reasoning and whatnot.
Right, and that's the thing people point to, that AI just flat out right now can't do in a human sense, actual causal reasoning, and that's the claim. There's people have various, people have lists. Here's things that AI just can't do at all, and both of us are universally, subscribed to. I don't know if GPT-3 has. I don't think so. I don't think it solved any of those really hard problems.
I think the rate at which we're finding the problems is decreasing with the number of parameters increasing. And that's what we're seeing with GPT-3. We're seeing fewer of those kinds of problems. That's the interesting thing. So even though Marcus could pick at GPT-3, something really interesting is going on. It looks like more of the same may represent a sort of qualitative shift.
A phase shift, like we were talking about before.
Phase transition.
Yeah.
I think that's what's going on, and that the conversation I had on GPT-3 with David Chalmers and Marcus Huntner about these issues really transformed my view of the scope and limits of purely deep learning systems.
Right. Okay. So, you know, and I want let's take that as an opportunity. What I really kind of wanted to discuss today was this basic question of what would it mean? What does it mean to even approach the idea of explaining the mind/brain, and what do we mean by that? You know, we're talking now about at a practical level. We're saying, okay, let's run some simulated experiments to try to test models. For example, it could be Andrew Coward's architecture, something I'd like to spend quite a bit of time in the semester thinking about. Can we fit Andrew Coward's architecture or some of it, or you know, it could be global workspace theory. It doesn't have to be Andrew Coward's architecture. It could be you know, the model of memory. There are lots of theoretical constructs about the brain that are out there. What would it mean to take one and to test it in a simulation? Right, that's the goal of the semester, to think about a question that we could say, okay, we've got the ability to simulate an agent in a 3D environment, and now we can run experiments that could never have been run before. What questions can we try to address? And so, you know, it gets you thinking about just the question of what is the point of this model? What are we trying to do? And if you push that question a little bit, it gives you, you know, what is it that science is trying to do essentially, right? I know that's pretty. It's a pretty broad question, but when we're trying to understand psychology or neuroscience, when we say, you know, we're applying science to it, what are we trying to do? Are we trying to predict it? Are we trying to simulate it? Are we trying to build one? These are all very basic questions that typically don't really even get addressed, right? So I think it's interesting if you think historically about the way the fields, I would say the fields of intelligence have emerged. So psychology, we have neuroscience, we have modeling, artificial intelligence. They kind of came from different branches of thought, different ways of approaching this problem. They were kind of trying to do different things. So in the case of artificial intelligence, you're trying to simulate, you're just trying to build something, and it works. And it really doesn't matter how it works so much, right? If it's able to do the things you want it to do, then you don't really care. That's a sort of an engineering approach. And then, you know, scientists will say, well, we don't understand how it works, right? So in the case of the brain, for example, we could try to simulate it. And maybe we could build a really good simulation in the sense that it would produce the same behaviors or some subset of the behaviors that we really want. At the same time, I would say, but it's not doing it the way human brains do it at all. So do we care, right? What are we trying to do here? Are we trying to actually build intelligence and maybe abstract it away from the specific details of how humans or biological systems do it? Or are we trying to understand how humans and biological systems do it? And I think there's actually, both answers are true. And in fact, what we have historically is completely different approaches based on these different goals. And so artificial intelligence kind of grew out of the idea of just stripping away the idea of intelligence from biology, and making it as abstract as possible in some sense to formalisms. So that's what math is. Math is a form of computation that's able to, it gives you these symbols that you can run operations over and then performs a kind of computation, which we could think of as a type of intelligence, right? You can answer problems with math that in some ways demonstrates that the system itself has a certain degree of intelligence. And then that kind of formal only approach ends up kind of transmogrifying, turning into computer science. And how do you build these equations into machines? How do you get machines to perform the equations? And because people are really slow, so the math works, but you need them to do these operations over symbols. Let's get a computer. Let's get a machine rather to do these operations over symbols. You have, you know, pre-electric versions of computers, things like Babbage, dividing engine. And these were machines, you know, they didn't even, for the widespread use of electricity. These were machines that could run these operations over symbolic representations of sorts, basically do the math that would take humans a long, long time to do. And so we have this long tradition of doing this kind of symbolic architectures in machines and that ends up becoming just at least one pathway, the computer. And there's something called the Turing machine. Let me pull up a little video. It's hard to find. I couldn't find a really neat little animation of a Turing machine. But I'll bet you know how to get one if you're on there. Where is this Turing machine thing? Okay, this gives a little bit of a flavor for it.
This hyper.
I have to share screen. Let's go. You know, before I actually run into the actual demonstration of the Turing machine, let me skip that for a second. So what Turing was trying to do, and you know, this is I'd say open to interpretation, but what Turing was trying to do was to completely formalize, make abstract the idea of mechanized intelligence. And Turing's machine, you could actually build it. You could build it with electronics or not. You could try to, there are various different ways you could instantiate it. But what Turing was trying to do, that's why I see him as sort of the bridge between what we typically would refer to as math and then this new field of computer, which ended up being called computer science, but shouldn't have been. Turing was certainly much more of much more of a contemporary and sorts of modern mathematics than he would have been of contemporary computer science. And so Turing had the idea of stripping away all of to the greatest extent possible, all of the messy details of how, say, biological systems. We're not going to worry about how biological systems instantiate intelligence. We're gonna try, however, to physicalize mathematics. Right? It was much more of a physicalization of a certain kind of mathematics than it was an attempt from the other direction to try to formalize biology. That's not where Turing was coming from. And what Turing ultimately achieved was he came up with a formalism of sorts that was useful, that you could actually build machines around. It wasn't his particular version of it, but it was the foundation. It laid the foundation for the entire concept of a computer, which then gets turned into these symbolic processors that are the ubiquitous form of computation until today. And so there's a historical arc there, right, of formalism all the way into modern computing. And that is going to guide artificial intelligence to a large extent. Artificial intelligence was, at least for a long time, trying to use these kind of symbolic representations. And neural networks, in some ways, I would say, are break from this, break from the formalized description. Neural networks are, in some ways, much more similar to certain kind of analog physical processes, because through largely local interactions, the system kind of solves itself rather than trying to conceptualize the system at a more abstract level. And so the system, the neural network is in some ways much closer to a brain, of course, but in a much more fundamental sense, in which that neural networks are models of biological systems. Right? They're kind of models of biological systems, and not just that they're kind of based on neurons, but they have something a little more biological about them. They run in parallel. They're meant to be based on these kind of local interactions, and that's really the starting point of Coward's talk, by the way, which is that brains are made out of neurons, and neurons can only interact locally, and therefore we have to start with that constraint. And any explanation you're going to give, so say global workspace theory, that global workspace theory, if it requires something global inherently, then it's not going to actually be scalable down to the neurons. That there's something missing. That would be the contention. That's my interpretation of Andrew Coward's response to that would be that it can't. It doesn't operate, or rather, the explanatory mechanisms don't operate at the neuron scale. That's how I was reading his response, by the way.
Yeah, and I'm didn't agree with his response. I think he I bet you anything he's not that familiar with the view.
Good, well,
Because he misinterprets that whole global thing,
Mhm.
right? I mean, I suspect that these views are so close. I'm going to ask Bernie Barnes. I wouldn't be surprised if Bernie saw Coward's view as a kind of instantiation of GW.
Could you maybe explain the global workspace theory, because I'm not familiar with it as well either, so just to
Sure.
get an idea of what that's about.
Sure. So global workspace views started as a view in information processing psychology back in the 90s, in the late 90s, though. That's why I was asking when Coward's recommendation architecture was first put out, okay? And so Bars wrote this 300-page book as an introspective psychologist saying, here's how consciousness works. There's something about working memory and attention that is capable of doing searches and pulling results from multiple parallel non-conscious computational processes. And then those processes, right, activate in the global workspace, which is a sort of, I mean, it's not a real space in the brain. It's what we might call a functional subsystem of the brain, intimately connected to, you know, certain, there's a neuroanatomical account, right? Later came Stan Dehane. He's a very famous neuroscientist, the global neuronal workspace, where when you look at the recommendation architecture, it doesn't look terribly different to what Dehane's been saying, right? Like about long-range neurons facilitating activation in the global workspace and just how information flows in the brain. In fact, when you look at what Coward's saying, to me, it doesn't look all that different from textbook computational neuroscience. He just puts it so beautifully. He puts it in terms of just a claim about information processing.
Yeah, I mean,
It's natural. But anyway, the interest here in the global workspace on my part is that there's so much more literature on it than on Coward. And it's a very similar view. And there's positions in AI. People try to work models, AI models that instantiate GW. So that could be of relevant to our group, right? So an example is Stan Franklin's IDA system. And another example is what Yosha Bengio's lab is doing right now.
Yeah.
So what is the difference between the two, since you mentioned they all look very similar, but so what would be the difference between them?
Can I add something on the difference there? Can I try to answer that? I'm sorry, what?
I was trying to hand you the mic. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. I think because I'm listening to what you're saying, Susan, and also like I asked Howard the same question and what Elon said earlier about. So I think there's two differences here. One, the first thing is that there is no actual location in the brain that individual neurons are all computing to. And I think it depends on how you would actually implement global workspace as to whether or not that's still going to be a difference. And I think the second question that we haven't talked about here that Coward brought up was that he thinks that consciousness and especially self-awareness, but consciousness too, is a learned feature. So you actually learn to create the neural connections that bring about this consciousness and self-awareness. And I don't see where that learning feature is instantiated in global workspace. And maybe I just don't know enough about it, but I see global workspace more as being like, these are your connections that are going to give you consciousness, and you're not actually learning how to form them.
Right. I agree with the second thing you said. I didn't see that in Barr's book or in Dehane's work, any claims at all about. And
Yeah.
I think it's an empirical issue whether infants have working memory attention, right? And developmentalists answer that question. And if they do, then I think there's a chance they have a global workspace, right? And so that would mean that potentially you could go back and ask developmentalists what's innate and what's not, and how it correlates with self-consciousness. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. But to your first point, Bars was never saying that there's a particular physical region of the brain. In fact, the workspace itself is spatiotemporally scattered, right? Because many non-conscious components of the brain could in fact be activated and delivered up to global activation. Instead, it's a functionally isolatable subsystem, you see, but not every functionally isolatable subsystem has to have a concrete physical location. Now, there are discussions. Where is the location of the workspace? Like what kind of system or subsystem of the brain instantiates the global workspace? Like Murray Shanahan for a while was talking about a thalamocortical loop in the brain, right? But I think there's a debate about that. But my guess is that Bars would see the recommendation architecture as an instantiation of GW. I mean, we could ask him. He'd come to class. He's like that.
Let's do it.
Yeah, I think we should.
That'd be great.
He's great. He's a great guy.
So yeah, and a lot of this just, and this is kind of related to the topic that I started off with, which if we're talking about these different theories, at what level they're making predictions, I think there's different levels at which Andrew Coward is making a claim, and in which global workspace theory is making a claim, and maybe they're making very similar claims, but they're kind of doing it at different levels. The mechanism. So Andrew Coward has a lot of detail about scale, sort of these different scales and the mechanism at which these different scales can happen. So I feel like, and Andrew Coward may say that's really the contribution, is actually being able to describe this at all the way down to the neuron scale, and the mechanisms that are operating at neuron levels are then leading to these kind of emergent properties that end up, that the system ends up having. So I don't know that they may be in sync, but on the other hand, what is, and this relates to a question I asked of Andrew during the talk, and it's the question that I think I really want to grapple with, which is what does it mean? What does it mean to understand a system? If we understand it at the functional level, which global workspace theory, I think it fits really functional, like historical kind of perspectives to understanding. Functionalism is basically the idea that you tell you, what does it do? I don't care how it does it. What's a doorstop? Well, there's lots of ways to build a doorstop. You can take your shoe and make that a doorstop. You could screw something into the ceiling, and that's a doorstop. And there's, I guess you could also put a vacuum that would suck the door closed, and that's also a doorstop. So the doorstop is a function, right? And the global workspace, I think, is operating mostly at the level that a lot of psychological theorizing tends to happen, which is really at this functional level. This is what it does. The brain takes information and it holds it for a certain amount of time, so on and so forth. And this is the kind of theorizing that you see going back early, certainly the 60s, psychology in general. There's something called the short-term memory buffer, and then there's a different thing called the long-term memory. And we're not making any claims about where it happens in the brain, and we're also not really making any claims about how you could build such a thing, and really how it emerges from neurons. Certainly not how it emerges from neurons, right? And so the Andrew Coward model is keeping the neurons really close, throughout the process of theorizing and saying, okay, I can't propose, some short-term memory workspace or something. I'm going to have to back it up with an entire, a cascade of neural activity. And if you can't do that, he's not going to propose it. So it's really a different level at which it's sort of explaining. And that's sort of the question that I want everybody to participate in grappling with is, what's the scale at which we are satisfied? What are the questions we want to answer? If we can build a system that's able to walk like a duck, talk like a duck, right? Be as intelligent as a duck or a human. But it's built in a way that's just doing it in a way that's not neurally inspired, for example. We think maybe it's completely different. Maybe GPT-3, for example, does it understand language? Maybe some people will come down firmly on the side of no, it doesn't. But if it has complete competence in language, is that sufficient? Have we learned something about language or about what it means to be intelligent? Is that sufficient for us? Or what are you guys doing here, right? What are you guys doing in this graduate program? Are you trying to understand the brain, or are you trying to build a brain? Are you trying to solve the problem of the brain in order to help people fix their brains? That's sort of the wide open question that I think is actually extremely relevant. And again, these different historical paths. The AI folks were just trying to get a machine to do their freaking accounting to a large extent. That was, there were a lot of hard math problems that you had to hire people to do. It cost a lot of money to get human programmers to do it, human operators, right, who are doing the math problems. Can we replace them with a machine? And that was a completely different path. Can we do it? I don't care if it's like the way humans do it. I may draw some inspiration from humans, I may not, but I just want to do it. And then there's this entire other path, neuroscience, psychology, and then the subfields of biology and chemistry are really attempts to say, how do humans do it? Why? We'll figure, why do you want to know that? Well, maybe it's to, design interventions, or maybe it's to build machines, but maybe it's just to understand how the brain works. Maybe it's for philosophical or religious reasons that you want to do it. So it's completely different paths of inquiry. And what I'd like to know is, as we're setting out in a journey to go and build simulated agents in environments where we're trying to do something, right? So what are we trying to do? And I'd love for people to jump in and say, what would you say is your goal in whatever field, and however you're approaching this? Or do you want to understand in order to do something, right? In order to maybe to create something or to solve a problem, or to understand? And what's the appropriate level? Is simulation, for example, sufficient if it's doing it in a way that produces the behaviors and we can play with the system, we can get it to do stuff? Or do you need to know how brains do it? So jump in. Claudius, I'd like to ask you first, because I know I have a prediction of what your answer is going to be, but
because I'm sorry if I'm monopolizing the talk, because
no, not at all. But I immediately thought of you because I kind of have an assumption about, okay, you're an applied guy to some extent, right? And you're coming at this, and you want to be able to just predict something in sports, and then train people to use that. So my guess was maybe you'd be like, I don't care how we get there, just give me intelligence.
Yeah, kind of. I'm kind of looking at it from both sides, because number one, I want to build a machine to be able to be better than humans at what they're doing. But I feel in order to do that, I have to come from the perspective of a human being. So we can't start off with a machine that just does things so differently. Like, for example, machines, they don't learn as we learn with experience, as we go through the world and learn on the fly. They learn in batches with all the information already there. So just from that starting point, you cannot say that you want to build a brain if you already starting off from a totally different viewpoint, in my mind. So I think we should start off from the constraints of whatever machine we're trying to build, and build the constraints in the machine. So humans have constraints as far as physical constraints, as far as attentional constraints. So machines don't have any of these constraints. They can just run through thousands and millions and billions of different numbers, and what you feel is the problem. But the way they're doing it is totally different. So
it's a critique of it, or you're
it's a critique of the approach. Like, I feel the approach is the wrong way to go about it. Just saying, we solved the problem of vision because we can identify cats and dogs in pictures. But if you was to show that artificial agent a picture of a cat on the moon, it wouldn't be able to recognize, because it's just in a different background. They have like a whole bunch of different pictures where they have like a fork on Mars or something, and forks are obviously easy to identify, and any human being could do it. A 2-year-old could do it, but the machine can't, because they're fundamentally using a different way of doing it. And that's kind of my frustration with.
Very interesting. So I think that's, it's a fantastic example of one line of criticism. And, which is to say, the way you're doing it now is too inherently different for the way humans do it, and therefore you'll never get there.
It's actually the exact opposite, I would even say, because everything that we as humans can do very easily, computers can't do, and anything that computers do very easily, we can do. So we can come up with, know exactly what is bigger. Is 500 divided by 7,257,000 bigger, or 7 million divided by 250,000 million? Like we can conceptualize that, and computer could tell you that in 1 second, or not even 1 second. But so we are just bad at all the things that computers can do, and computers are just bad at the things that we can do. We can figure out if there's a cat, if you just see like a tail, like 1% of the tail behind the couch, the computer wouldn't be able to figure that out. So it's like those types of things.
So what about the fact that computers have made enormous progress in the just in the past 10 years?
Yeah, definitely. And
So
I mean, it's useful for different applications. So I'm not saying we shouldn't go that route. It's definitely useful for identifying people on pictures and those types of things. Like,
let me pose this question. The fact that neural networks, for example, work so much better. In other words, they're much closer to humans than anything that came before. Do people, in general, and there's not just for Claudius, but in general, does that argue for the idea? Oh well, it's closer to human intelligence in terms of its function. It's probably that argues that it's fundamentally maybe the right approach, or is there a concern that no, don't be fooled by one success? Really, all you've got is neural networks are basically able to do just come up with a hyper kind of hyperplane between many hyperplanes between data points in order to segregate them into various spaces so that you can actually do the problem of classification. But it's just I've heard it say it's just a fancy form of line fitting, and that's not fair at all because it's many different lines that could take arbitrary shapes. So it's really qualitatively different. But that being said, just because it's successful, does that argue? Because I always make that point. That's the way I introduce my own interest. I say neural networks are modeled on the brain, at least loosely, and they're successful in a way that people argue was never going to be possible with computer vision and they can perform human level or even superhuman level performance on tasks that were previously the domain only of humans. Is that a convincing argument to people? Do people think that because they're working, that means they might actually be the right approach to simulating, actually modeling the brain? There's a lot of background. I think I got it. So that question's an open one, right? It's the fact that AI is working now. Does that mean we should scientists say, hey, look, let's chase after that? Some people would say, nah, the fact that technology is useful doesn't argue for the fact that it's actually an important way of understanding brains. Anybody have any reaction to that?
So it's a lot to take in, but so I think it's for everything that we try to. I want to say we kind of poison ourselves when we try to create anything that's artificial intelligence because it already is built with an intent. More so, I think to mimic a brain, you would have to just give it a form of catalyst, and then something will emerge, and then go along in that manner. So, most I want to say most we're trying to solve a problem, and so we take these ideas and we take them in different fields, and then we use a preconceived vocabulary that is only inherent to us, and then we give it to a machine per se, and it of course computates faster and have better resources in certain areas, and it comes back with some things that we might not be able to compute now, and we say it's artificially intelligent. But I think what Andrew was trying to say more so is that you have an architecture that always reacts the same way. And I think you would build on that architecture with everything else. It's almost like he lays the catalyst, and then from that point on, you can kind of do what you want, as if how we learn in general.
So when you say catalyst, you mean he's kind of, it's like it's a start?
Yeah, I think
Not-
he has a very strong emphasis on the system, and the neurons are just what they are. So it's almost like saying, okay, you know, I'm gonna give you a framework for the car, and the car's purpose is to drive, but the car can take, you know, the car can do many other things. You know what I mean? But you need this catalyst to kind of start off. So he's almost like saying there's nothing unique about neurons. They do what they do. And I think that we build models with purpose, more so a neuron structurally just is inherently does this thing very great. And there has to be something else on top of that that are commanding or using a system in a higher level.
Interesting. So yeah, and I think you know, there's a topic of conversation in earlier section was, you know, this idea of reward, and which can be quite nebulous in terms of thinking about this in a system. But that's gonna who is it? Somebody mentioned that Andrew Coward gave a response about biasing a system in a certain direction. But of course, what happens developmentally is some actions are rewarded and some are not. And that's going to determine what the neurons do, at least in our conception of them, right? Like, and I think I think you're making a very important point, which is that we are, in talking about what neurons do and what brains do, or what an AI system does, we are probably in some sense imposing meaning on it. But that meaning really is contextualized based on some assumed function. And I think what Andrew Coward is after at some level is to say, you know, can we just think about neurons almost objectively, not doing anything, and then except just hanging out with their neighbors and doing whatever neurons do, you know, sending each other electrochemical messages, and that's not doing anything, right? That's not doesn't have a purpose in and of itself outside of the neuron. The neuron itself, what's its purpose? You know, probably has its own, organismic needs that it needs to take care of. It's an organism after all, and you know, it's got to take care of. It's got to do what it's got to do in order to survive, and presumably neurons are doing what they need to do, but they don't know that they're being used towards the purpose of listening to a lecturer and trying to understand what they're saying, so that you can go on and have a profession. Right? They don't understand. There's no sense in which neurons, in any way, shape, or form, could be said to have that as their goal or what they're doing. So how then does the system emerge to have these goals and so on and so forth? Ultimately, you have to have some sort of reward at some level of the system that percolates back down to the neural connections, but the neurons never find out about it, right? Because they don't have the concepts.
But that's what, don't you have to start off then? Like I said in last class, you have to start off with the person, because that's who are the neurons are inside, like the human body. So yeah, that's what their perspective is. Their perspective is not objective. So that's like kind of the disconnect again with computer systems, because all the code is put in to be objective. So I always like to use analogies because that's how the world makes sense to me. But if I was to get a reward, and the reward is, okay, I get to watch football on TV for an hour, to you that might not be a reward if you don't like football. So like computer systems are trying to put in the reward. Okay, if we have an hour of football, then this is going to be 1 point or however many points, and then we're going to run it through the system. And you run through every system, you run the same objective goals or rewards, which goals and rewards are not objective, they're subjective. So you cannot have all computer systems have the same goals and the same rewards. So it has to be linked to some constraint that is put forth by whoever builds the system. It has to have special constraints, like we have constraints in our bodies, and physical constraints and attention constraints and all that.
Yeah. So I really think I can sound like a neural network chauvinist in some sense. Like this is, I think in our lifetime it might be the biggest leap in terms of our understanding of artificial intelligence, what intelligence, at least how to embody intelligence at all, and also I think possibly a good thought tool or maybe even a model of the brain. At the same time, the way the people are currently thinking about it, the way the community are currently doing it is extraordinarily limited. And as Claudius is really pointing out, it's nothing like the way humans learn. And maybe even more to the point, an isolated, localized, a neural network, which is built to do one kind of thing, is not a brain by any stretch. Your brains have a lot of other features, like different modules made of neurons with different structures, and interconnections between them, and all of that stuff. And it's completely missing from anything that people are currently deploying, as deep learning models, because they're useful for these limited kinds of classification problems, pattern recognition, pattern generation. That's really what they're good, right? We have generative models too. It's not just classification, it's generation of, but it's still just either being able to discriminate between patterns or being able to create similar patterns to patterns that you've learned. That's really, I'd say, I'd go down a limb and say that that's all neural networks are able to do. Is that comparable to, whatever is that, are there functions in the brain that just are unapproachable by that method? We could speculate about that, but at the same, it's certainly true. What Claudius, your point is certainly accurate, that we're not training neural networks. We're not embedding them in larger complex structures. We're not, and we're not certainly training them in the way that humans or any other organism are trained. And I guess the question that I have is, how big a concern is that? And then do we have, what's the solution? And I'd say Andrew Carr's architecture, I would say, is a hell of a lot more thorough and a lot more comprehensive than, you train a layer of neural networks. For him, that's like, oh yeah, okay, fine. I already have my hyper. Is that how my columns are getting are changing their weights? Great, but here's the rest of the model. He's got a lot more to say than you have a multi-layer or even a residual net, whatever. The fanciest version of a neural network is only going to be one subset of the system, and so I think
that's why I think his point of view is so intriguing, and that's why I think it'd be a good starting point to see if that can be somehow incorporated into computers. That's why I'm so excited about reading more about it.
That's what this class is for. Sorry, who was talking?
I just wanted to jump in. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I feel like we already touched on it earlier, but to me, like this question of, is this like the brain is a good question. Back to what you said, Ilana, like about what are you trying to do? Because if I'm trying to build something to execute, I would want to leverage what a computer can do better than I can do and build the system around that. I might not even want to think about how the brain does it, depending on what I'm trying to do. But the problem is, and I think this is where a lot of AI researchers come to, is okay, this is what I want to do. I have no idea how to do that if I'm not modeling it off of something in the universe. Like, think of trying to build consciousness and not knowing anything about consciousness. Like it's probably going to lead you back to this path of saying, okay, what's the best model I have to look at and how can I work with that? And you might end up right back at the brain. And so like personally, that's what happened to me. I was like, I don't care about the brain. I want to build a conscious machine. And then I was like, all right, I have no idea how to do that. I need to like look at the brain. And so it's this like never ending cycle of how much do you actually need to be like the real thing in order to accomplish what you want? And I think it's just, to me, that's why like I think that's why I wanted to recommend like Gary Marcus's Kludge, because that's, if you think the brain is the best way of doing it, then yeah, you probably want to borrow a lot from it. But if you don't actually think the brain is that good at what it does, it just happened to evolve because of evolution, then, that's another consideration.
So we have. Go ahead.
Sorry, if I may. I kind of wanted to build on that. Claudius was saying like there are things that machines can do that are very specialized that we can't do at the same speed. Like their processing speed is just much more efficient and specialized than us. And I was thinking like something could be functionally similar without being like technically similar. So, you know, if it does kind of depend on, you know, what you're trying to do. So like, for instance, like I'm interested in learning about, you know, creating parasocial relationships with virtual agents that in an attempt to decrease loneliness. And there are certain aspects that you can take from, you know, like elements of a human that might be useful, you know, to like replicate behaviors that might in turn decrease loneliness. But, you know, like, do you actually need to like simulate an entire human brain to achieve that goal? I was also thinking like, you know, if you're trying to if you're trying to replicate a brain, you know, to learn, to simulate, you know, responses that it might have to certain stimuli, you could like, it would probably be useful if you're trying to derive like general principles about how it would behave in response to certain, but you would probably already have a pretty good understanding of how it would work by the time you were able to simulate it, right? I mean, I would imagine so anyway.
I think that's, you know, that's sort of the question. We could try to simulate it just at the superficial observable level of behavior. It doesn't mean we have a rich understanding of how it works.
By the way, like just to clarify, I'm not supposed that we build a brain like as far as the physical structure of it or even all the components of it. So I'm not suggesting that, like all the proteins and all that it has in it. But I'm saying, shouldn't we start off from a point where what we are, how we learn and how we grasp the world, like start off from that point, and if we're trying to recreate a conscious machine or even like a functional machine that has a general purpose that can do different things and not just specialized on one thing or another.
What do you guys think? Who agrees that?
If I could put in a comment on this, I was particularly struck by Andrew Coward yesterday telling us that neurons only see their neighbor neurons. And so for a day now, I've been kind of trying to get my mind around what can you do with that. But what came to mind listening to this discussion, in my background, I was one of the earliest creators of virtual machines on a PC. And when we are creating a brain emulation, if you will, just because neurons can only see their neighbors doesn't mean that we have to make them only see their neighbors. That we could have a conceptual meta circuit, if you will, that can see all neurons all the time for our benefit in making this emulation work. That was all the point I wanted to make, is that when we're actually implementing, we don't have to physically do things the same way and model physical processes.
That's the point that Rachel's making, and I think Akil made as well. You know, a couple of folks have pointed out that there's just some things humans suck at, and if we can supersede that, and why do we have to worry that if it's a constraint of it? And I think the same is true in brains. They're biologically defined, and distance is really a problem you have to solve. You have to actually build with proteins. It's expensive, metabolic resources in order to communicate, and you don't want to have long-term unless absolutely necessary, because you have to get the message from your little finger all the way to your brain in order to realize that you hit yourself with a hammer. You don't really want to send long projections, right? There's really serious reasons you don't want to talk to anybody but your neighbors unless you absolutely have to. And so that's a constraint that happens to be true for physiologically built brains. It might end up being true for hardware implementation. So maybe lessons learned that we want to learn from that constraint, because it may end up showing up again. But if we're building a complete simulation, for example, a neural network, where localization, there's no meaningful sense, you know, location in actual memory of two neurons that are close together or they're not close together in memory, you know, random access memory or you know, in a kind of virtual space. So maybe we just ignore that and we don't even think about the constraints of localization of you know, local. But that's the whole point of Andrew Coward's model. The whole point is that neurons only express themselves locally. So maybe I would say forget it. Or, you know, we don't have to think about this. Maybe we shouldn't even work with his model. You know, Rachel, you know, here's a challenge, right? If we're interested in super intelligence, maybe we should not be worrying about the constraints that Andrew Coward actually stipulates.
Well, I have a ton of counter arguments on that. I don't know how much you want to hear that right now, but I think one good counter argument is that yes, you're doing this local thing, but unless you are doing this local thing, you're not going to see emergence. And there's other work to back this up, like Good AI, Badger architecture. There's all of the complex systems like typical work. And I think in Coward's architecture, a really good embodiment of this problem is that he has this thing he talked about called receptive field expansion. And so that means that, and we know this happens from neuroscience, if you take neuroscience things to be true, but we know that there's this process called synaptic pruning. And if you haven't heard of this, basically you take resources that build synapses in neurons and you figure out where to put them. So the next day when you wake up, you can use those to learn new things. And that's a really important part of learning. And the mechanism by which Coward says that works on a topographical scale. So when I say that, I mean that you have some neighborhood and where you're going to put the new synapses have to do with how much activity is in your neighborhood. So if you're not set up topographically, you're not going to be able to compute that algorithm properly. So that is like an argument against just doing this combinatorial network approach and doing a more topographical network approach.
Okay, well, that being said, Coward himself stipulates that there's a set of constraints under which this kind of intelligence emerges, and his model is contingent on those constraints. He has two, as far as I can tell, there were two, which is some sort of resource constraints and also the desire to not overwrite, catastrophic like overwriting of memory. He said he sort of started with those as those are the things you need. You got to conserve. Conservation is better, right? You start off with evolutionary argument, right? If you're more metabolically, or if you're some able to conserve resources better, you're gonna be outperform, and therefore you have more genetic fitness, and so on and so forth. And then this problem of overwriting that he also mentioned. But he stipulates that those are when you'll see consciousness emerge. So here's the interesting thing. One way to put this is the brain is it's a piece of crap, right? Like Kluge, but it's the best piece of crap that we know of, and it's the only one. People often say this about democracy, right? It's the worst system of government except for all the other ones. If you've ever heard that phrase. The brain is the worst intelligent system except for there's no, maybe the metaphor didn't quite work, but we don't know of any others. This is the only system we've got that we know does this crazy, amazing stuff that we somehow think is really important, right? Whether we want to simulate it, whether we want to understand it, the only thing we know that is able to do it is the brain. And so I would say, a good response to the attack is just, well, who says you'll be able to find some other path to intelligence? Like Claudius is saying, I think Andrew Coward might argue, is this is the only one that we know in the history of the universe that we know of that got here. And so do you really want to try some other path amongst the branch,
that's
trillions of branches?
Actually a good point. Like you mentioned the constraints. And so the point I'm trying to make, so constraints, like the way y'all described it before, were like limitations. So your constraint is a limitation on what you can do. Like you have to have neurons firing that are next to each other. They're the only ones who can talk to each other. But like constraints are not just a hindrance and not just a bug. They're also a feature. I mean, constraints show you what's the more efficient way of doing something. So if you had to go across the room and you wouldn't have any constraints between time and space or anything, there would be unlimited amount of ways you can get across the room. But just because we have the constraints of time and space, now you have to find out, okay, what's the most direct path? So that provides you with the answer to whatever question. So that's why computers, in my view, are not good at figuring anything out quickly. They have to run through batches and batches of millions of different things and try to find a pattern, as opposed to a human who can, because they have the constraint, it basically guides them to the answer. And like that's like one of the approaches I'm trying to use, and that's one of the things I'm trying to build, is a machine that has so many constraints that the answer is going to be found much quicker. It might not be able to do things as well as other computers, but it's going to be able to find the answer much quicker because it has it has to be more efficient in order to get there. And by building in those constraints, I think you can achieve that. So that's kind of what I'm trying to build and trying to create.
It would be really interesting if only the machines that had the kind of constraints that the brain had when it evolved turned out to be conscious.
It would sure would. You know, and that's sort of, you know, it's almost a testable hypothesis, but it's almost trivially true that, you know, an evolutionary process is gonna enhance things, right? It's going to, so constraints are, you know, just like competition, force the system to become better at solving the problem of those constraints, right? It's almost just by definition true. But we want, right? We feel like, sorry, Susan, what? Yeah, go ahead.
I don't think it is.
No, you don't think.
Here's the thing. Okay, so remember, there are different kinds of evolution. There's Darwinian evolution, and there's other forms, right? And AI is not, in general, except in context of A-life researchers specify Darwinian parameters. AI is evolving, but it's evolving with other constraints, non-Darwinian constraints. So, for example, the constraints it has are financial and regulatory. That's weird, right? And it's really weird. And I mean, I understand why people look to the
bureaucratic, and it's true.
Right. I mean, and now when you think about it, all this money is being thrown at it, and there's so much more data. Data is a big constraint. That's why connectionism didn't take off the way deep learning did. You know.
Yeah, I mentioned that a little earlier. That once it started working, there was this sort of virtuous circle, you know, and then this phase transition, right? Once it started working, there was so much more research on it, and then they're getting smarter. Right, these whatever we want to think of them, these new intelligences are getting smarter by virtue of the fact that they work to solve these problems. It's so strange, and you know, that's a social phenomenon, right? That's like you said, it's a financial and regulatory and whatever that environment that they.
It's intelligent design. That's the weird part.
Sure.
Here, I'm literally quoting Richard Dawkins.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because we're the designers, not God. And that's freaky, by the way. But
yes and no, unless you would think we were designed by God, right? So there, you just push the problem back, and so God designed.
Sure. I'll put it humbly, because we'll fuck it up. Fuck everything up. Like, I mean, the weird thing though, I can understand why we would look to the brain. Like Rachel said, this is the machine we know, the thinking machine. So we should borrow from it any way we can.
Claudius too.
But at the same time, yeah, and Claudius too, right? At the same time, though, ultimately AI will not have the spatial constraints of the cranium or the metabolic demands of the biological brain. We can build.
It kind of does though with as far as how much energy it takes to run a system, and like that's not gonna be sustainable depending on how much faster these systems get and how much more computing power they're gonna need in order to solve bigger and bigger problems. So that's a constraint that you're gonna have to think about as far as efficiency.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, there's issues like Moore's law, but they're not the very same issues that neurons have.
No, they're not.
Those are constraints.
But they are constraints. But if we make the constraints, if we just broadly define constraints, of course there are constraints. The question is, do we try to think about modeling the kinds of specific constraints that humans or other evolved systems had to confront? Again, going back to the idea that, well, it's the only way we know we got anything like human level intelligence. It sounds like, you know, but who knows, right? I don't know. Do you have a reason, you know, a sort of systematic argument as to why we should not just try to follow in the footsteps of evolution, given that that's a path that we know works? You know, is there some, you know, programmatic reason to make that case? I don't know. I'd like to hear, you know, what one could say either way. I mean, there's a very complex argument about this possible space of ideas that people could try with AI. It's a very weird kind of space altogether to think about exploring. They say that nature has gone down, one manifold through that space, and therefore that's informative or maybe not, right? Maybe just you run the clock and you'll get a different kind of intelligence. But we know that's not probably true because we look at other, life-supporting planets probably don't have intelligence, at least as far as we can tell so far. It's pretty rare. I don't know. I think
Can I
it's
ask a very mainstream question?
yes, please.
So let's say we do reverse engineer a brain and we put it in a vessel of some sort. What, besides maybe conducting unethical research on this robot, what else is the purpose or the objective?
That's the big question I'm asking. And so I have almost an existential crisis. I'm like, oh, do I have a good answer to that question? Good question. What is it we're trying to do here, folks? What's your answer, John? I mean, why, if you're not trying to build one, why are you trying to understand the brain? What are you trying to do?
That's a good question. It's definitely something that I would love to learn more about, and I think that there's so much to learn about it. And
that's just curiosity, right? You're just and
everybody's brain is different, and I feel like everybody takes certain things into account and kind of produces them in.
So would you be satisfied or unsatisfied if we were able to build? Here's a computer. We could walk you to it. It's got the ability to do just about anything a human can do. And you ask, how does it work? We say, well, it's just a it's just a 5 trillion parameter ResNet, and combined with a transformer model. I can tell you about the math of those. Would you be like, okay, I'm satisfied. My curiosity has been slaked, or not so much?
I don't know. It depends how thorough it is, and
okay. I was trying to. I thought that was a trick question to get you to say. No, of course not. That's not. I wouldn't understand anything about myself or other people. I would just know that there's this computer that can do that. But I think you more wisely answered. Well, tell me exactly how that computer does what it does, and then I'll judge. Right. And
even if we do produce something that like shows us the human behavior, or like, I feel like everybody's different. So everybody will take certain experiences and produce them in their own way.
Yeah, and man, does that get at the big question? Is like, is there a theory of the brain? And maybe every brain is its own theory. Presumably, there's something general, and we know there's something general because we can replicate, behaviors across generations and across people, and on some level they all look the same. But of course, people are not the same, right? They're infinitely different from one another, in terms of just even physically thinking about the brain structure and how you somehow measure difference. They're going to be so different. So yeah, these are exactly the kind of questions I think it's important for people to be asking, and people are doing this kind of work. And why do I do it? I'd say private curiosity, and there's lots of people who are just doing it because they're science. They sort of have this kind of mind that wants to get answers to this stuff. But at the same time, I think it's very worthwhile to say, hey, why are you doing it? And why are we doing it? And is this something society is, why is society doing it? Why is industry doing it? And what are we trying to achieve? Because what industry may want to do is just straight up, give me the freaking answer right now. I don't care how you get it. Right? And I think that's where, again, a lot of the history of computing really was driven by industry. You try to solve math problems that they were already solving, or that they couldn't solve, but they suspected they could solve with this. That's probably a very different goal than somebody who's saying trying to understand out of curiosity's sake. And so, what are we trying to do? Yeah, sorry.
I'm sorry. So, two things. I'm curious about, but I would kind of categorize something artificial intelligent as if I leave it alone and come back in a year, and it's created something, and I would go, wait a second, where did you learn how to do that? And then it was a while. I took some things together and I made these parts, and I'm like, yeah, but how do you even know what is material? So that to me would be something, and again, that's almost like if I came to this planet and I dropped my family off, I come back, and then I go, well, look at all this progress. How did you do it? That I would consider something that's like that as something artificial intelligent, more so. And then you wouldn't even use the word artificial anymore because it probably would feel so real. You're just like, this this thing's intelligent, you know.
Mm.
So when we look at trying to put these constraints in, I think it kind of pigeonholes us into the exact same idea all the time. It's why I believe that things that we're building now is answering these questions, these old questions. You know what I mean? I think because we've already kind of implanted that seed in the theories and the algorithms and the calculations already, and we come back, you know, we go into the future and we go, wow, it's pointing to the same. Well, it was kind of headed that way anyways by just going down the hill, but we just couldn't see that far, And that's the second thing is the constraints. I want to talk a little bit more about that. Is I would say to really build the computational box and give it this, and I guess we implant these constraints that we know about the universe into it. It's not the same thing as experiencing these constraints, and maybe there's a difference between, we do simple pattern matching a lot, and it's actually 2D pictures, but 3D pictures in a 2D format more so. So a system is understanding these different patterns, but we don't perceive things in that matter. I think there's a lot of spatial information that's being recorded in the neurons that we are not implanting in systems in general, because it's not sensing the world in that way. So I think by us, let's say if I'm sitting down learning about cats, or I'm standing up learning about cats, even though it's about the same subject, it's happening in a different way. And I believe sometimes we miss a lot of that encoding, as far as when we try to train a model in that way. So I don't think we need to, I believe if we don't look at everything as a computational problem in different pieces, and look at it as a more of a I want to say complex problem, but more of a integration of many different other senses problem, we might get different readings. More different, more complex constraints that might cause emergence.
That couldn't be in some ways a better articulation, I think, of why we're trying to do this kind of simulation and Unity and all this kind of stuff. I think, to kind of arrive there again, I think that's the point, is we kind of have to, I know we have to, again, that's I guess something we could debate, but there's so much more to the way that the human-like systems emerge than anything that's happening in standard kind of deep learning and machine learning in general. And if we're not thinking about all the other stuff, all the constraints and then the complexity of the system itself, then we're not going down what has again proven to be a very fruitful path. And we can debate whether we need this constraint or that constraint. And I think that's a very reasonable debate. But at the same time, if we have the opportunity to do something like training a virtual organism, right, in 3D, maybe with a somewhat more complex brain than just a bunch of layers and uniform kind of homogeneous layers, then we're not stealing everything we can from what we know from nature. And so, did you feel? Akhil, we haven't really talked that much about this idea which is supposed to be the theme of the semester, but if we take a virtual organism that's got, have to move through space and have to understand, its spatial location, maybe even in depth, and might have constraints on its, an energy. It has to move around, and that takes energy, and it has to take in information through its senses, and even that takes a little bit of metabolic resources. And then we try to use that and train an AI that way. Is that better? Do you see that as a step in the right direction compared to some of the things you're critiquing?
I think it would be closer to what we might be experiencing, more so than what we are trying to implant into a model. I think there's a lot more that we might take for granted, that the brain and the evolution per se, if you want to say that, has has done a very good job, and we don't know that because it's worked so well. You know what I mean? It's so hidden. It's so designed well. It's so hidden that we seem to think it doesn't exist sometimes. And I think the path of growth, you know, from infant to where we are now, I think there's a lot of information that's encoded that we take for granted, and so we wouldn't even decide to program it or model it. You know what I mean? Or add it as an additive, as a form of constraint. Or
Yeah,
I should say,
which
so,
is great.
yeah.
Exactly. I mean, it may have been the magic, you know, the secret ingredient. And how the hell would we know? So unless we may just miss out if we don't include it. I think that seems to be, you know, I think the strong argument in my mind to try to do some actual as realistic as we can, brain modeling and environmental modeling, and maybe you know, and the interaction between them. Susan, what's
Oh, I gotta run. I'm sorry, I have a meeting.
you're always late.
I'll talk to you later. No, it's my fault. But Elon,
This is actually where I just realized. We keep going.
let's talk later about the sandbox.
Yeah,
I will. Okay, all right. Bye, everybody. See you
Yeah,
later.
I don't want to keep people.
Bye.
I don't want to keep. I'm sure people do have places to be. I'm sorry, I didn't even quite realize how late it was. This was, to me, you know, a very exciting exchange, and I think that you know, people really bring different perspectives to this question. It's kind of a new question. I would say Turing and you know, Minsky and these folks, we're on the same path in terms of trying to figure some of this stuff out, but they didn't, frankly, have the tools we do, and now is a new era of trying to understand or model intelligence. So it's a new frontier, and it's important to make wise decisions early on, because you know what can happen? You could have solutions like neural networks that really do lie dormant, depending on the version of history you believe. But at least the traditional public version of history is that scientific history is that these things really didn't quite work, and everybody ignored them, and we therefore wasted, in some ways, you know, 50, 60 years of potential progress that could have been made, for example, in computer vision. The approaches, the symbolic approaches to whatever you want to call them, the sort of classical approach to computer vision, which is hand-tuned filters as opposed to learned filters. If you want to just, in a nutshell, that's kind of what, you know, the big difference is. Do you, as a clever human, try to figure out a way to characterize the inputs such that you can recognize them and, you know, split them up into various, you know, the features in the feature space that you then try to make a decision based on where a given object falls within that feature space, or do you anneal to it, right? Or do you solve it in this machine learning kind of way? And history, at least as far as we can tell now, really borne out one approach, not the other. And the approach that won for most of the time turned out to be the wrong approach. The symbolic kind of classical approach didn't end up solving the problem, and it probably never was going to. And it's hard to say that people who spent 30, 40 years of their career working on it really contributed. I mean, it's as sad as it is, but they're, you know, this sort of the best model and sort of the classical architecture. I'm blanking on it. It rhymes with like is something. What am I thinking of? Anybody? So that model is not going to be cited. Nobody's going to use it. These were hand-coded features, and that's just the wrong way to go. And so we want to try to make the right decision for ourselves and for you know, our you know, students who come after us. And I don't mean that literally, but also literally. So that's the question I think we're trying to think about this semester, because some of us are you know, actually going to go ahead and do this. And I say, look at Rachel right here, and she has a dissertation to finish, right? In the short-term goal sort of sense, and then really has to decide, you know, what's the best path. She's going on a new path that humans have never gone on before, I would say, in, you know, implementing Andrew Coward architecture in Unity. Nobody's done that, I promise you. And let's, you know, we have to make some decisions about how we might want to implement that. But more broadly, I think all of us can play a role in not just Rachel's dissertation, but in, certainly in how whatever it is we're doing next in our research and thinking about these questions. I think everybody here, even the people who haven't spoken up yet, have something to add to this conversation.
I would certainly hope so, because if my thing doesn't work out, I hope someone else's thing works out even better,
So basically, we're all just going to do this parallel processing thing. We're just going to each do a different version of an experiment, and then whichever one works is going to be Rachel's dissertation. How does that sound? Excellent. Okay, I'm glad we're all in agreement there. And this is legally binding because it's being recorded, so
I think I just want to add too, I think this is why it's like so important in science to publish your failures too, or at least make them known, because then that way like someone else doesn't have to try it and fail again. Like all those people that tried and it didn't work out for them, it's still just as useful to know that like that's not the path, just as much it is to know like this is the path.
There's a systemic problem in that people cannot get their failures published, and so the review process is not sympathetic. People have tried to start journals around it. Actually, the one journal, I don't know if it's still in existence, is Failed Replications. Even that you can't publish, which you should surely want to publish, right? This is a claim that's widely held, that's widely believed based on some earlier research. I reran the experiment, it didn't work. Shouldn't the community want to know about that? Even that doesn't get published, right? Much less, I tried some new thing that nobody's tried before. It didn't produce any, p-values of significance. Nobody will publish that. It's unpublishable. And that's, of course, it's such an important point, right? That somebody else is going to go down that path now. Great. We could have easily put up a warning sign, cliff ahead. There goes, somebody's 5 years spent on their dissertation, and also the community doesn't benefit from, what they could have done otherwise. So I think it's a fantastic point. It's something that, I think with AI, with this kind of simulation and stuff, it's easier to just put stuff out there, and just open source. There's archive, and there's a new system that's emerging that allows people to just put information out there. And failure should be, I agree, publicized.
That problem came up. I attended a workshop last year it was a COVID workshop. Well, it was the University of Maryland's network epidemiology workshop, and it was basically about network science and trying to solve the epidemic issue and model it and things that way. And there were a lot of folks talking about that exact thing with failed experiment papers, because it was an opposite thing that happened, where there was a publisher who couldn't get his paper, one of the most important papers that they were using at one point.
But for 1 second,
denied, and they were taking all the rest of his stuff, but it was one that was to the core that would have helped them in general. And they talked about the failing, wishing to have an ability to have access to work that did not make it, so everyone would know, because we can try it out again, maybe in 5 or 10 years, with different either technology or hardware, and it's not available and it's not known, and it dies with the person who did the experiments.
Or I think it's like, it would be so useful to maybe like look at someone's work, and then maybe someone else might have the one key insight they were missing. So sometimes it's like cooking, like maybe you made this whole dish, but you left out this really awesome ingredient that would actually make it taste good. Like, I don't know if you've ever made pasta, like Italian pasta sauce, but if you forget to put sugar in it and you're making it from real tomatoes, you'll really screw the whole thing up because it'll be too acidic. So someone could like do that same with science. Like you could do this whole project, but leave out, not see this one key insight. And then if you publish that later, someone could come along and just be like, oh, this is the one part that you were missing. I'm just going to recreate it and put that in there.
Can I add something too, guys?
Please.
I don't know where I wanted this to come up because a couple people were talking. So you guys tell me. You were talking about like successes of like a dissertation specifically. There's a blog called 80,000 Hours run out of San Francisco and Oxford. They do some cool stuff. I encourage you to check it out. They do cool stuff for the world, but they also do like career recommendations specifically for academics. And the thing that they've found in hiring like a team of researchers and analysts is that like most research like isn't actually valuable. Like if you wanted to put a number on like how valuable any particular research finding was, you could use any number of metrics like H-index or any other citation count or stuff like that. It turns out like a majority, like 20% of the people or less receive 80% of the citations, which is just interesting to think about that.
It's not valuable, right? That doesn't mean it's not valuable.
Wait. I'm going to interrupt once more. And then the second thing is that many dissertations are not actually what is cited, and the stuff that's in the dissertation isn't what is cited. It's the career that people build after having some foundational knowledge. So I would treat those two independently, and I foreshadow your response, Elon. I know these are all improper metrics because citation isn't necessarily the best measure.
No, and here's what I would say about that. If you toil away, your whole life as a scientist, and you actually discover some really, really important stuff, and nobody ever reads it, if a tree falls in the forest, right? It's like, what was the point, right? And so, on some level, operationally, you're right. If people are not citing it and it just fizzles out, then it didn't have value. But that doesn't mean, of course, it's not valuable or it's not potentially valuable. The system is an extremely imperfect one in terms of how the stuff gets disseminated. Andrew Coward is a perfect example. I'm suspicious that he's actually got a tremendous amount of value in his ideas.
His papers are cited literally 3 times, but that doesn't mean that like when he dies that it might not, not to be grave, but like great artists like Picasso, like it could be found later just because it hasn't.
Well, maybe it's up to us, right? And so it may end up having immense value even operationally. But let's say nobody ever paid attention. These books went out of print and nobody ever saw them again, right? Then what's the point, right? And so that's certainly true. So the H-index and these types of things are certainly measuring how causally effective they are, at least, in terms of moving scientific thought, but they don't demonstrate whether they are, it might be very valuable information. And I just want to make a meta point, a related one, which is, the problem is one of resource constraints, right? Which is if we publish everything, if everybody just puts everything on archive, with, let's say, no peer review, right? Do things get turned down? William mentioned earlier, Jan LeCun's own paper on convolutional neural networks got turned down because it wasn't sufficiently accurate. Again, really, to some extent, he invented the principle of convolutional networks. Does Jan LeCun's idea really suck that bad that it shouldn't get published? Probably not. So peer review is highly imperfect. It's just highly human, non-published stuff. So what do? Well, archive is, another approach is just to put everything out there. But then if everybody puts everything out there without any peer review, who the hell is going to read it, right? You don't know what to read. And so
I gotta jump in here a little bit, Elon, because it's like my favorite.
I had you in mind the whole time.
Yeah, of course. I'm just we're continuously finding as a group, really fundamental results that were discovered and then put back on the shelf, and it doesn't really make any sense. Just very, very fundamental kind of basic computers. For example, computers made out of water, right? Something that doesn't even kind of make any sense. But computers have nothing to do with electricity, that run on fluids and can do very sophisticated digital computations. These were invented in the mid 60s. I'll give somebody $20 if you can find anything about them online. It's not classified in any official sense. It published and got put in peer review. It was in Scientific American, for goodness sake. But now here we are 65 years later. And again, see what you can find on the internet about them, because they're still, I call them victims of their own success. They're too important to just tell everybody on the planet how it works. And I think that's the same thing with these neural networks.
Exactly. And so, the dissemination, again, it's an extremely complex social, human, bureaucratic, legal, all of that stuff. Just think about IP and think about people do protect their information. So there's
just to kind of make it to bring it home. There was a quote, I think we had it in one of our slides. Putin was quoted maybe about a year ago or so, saying that he felt that neural networks were more important than atomic weapons, and that any country that controlled, AI is going to control the planet.
AI, I don't think he probably didn't have the expertise to say neural networks even, but he knew AI.
He said AI. He said AI, not neural networks. But we can use them as synonyms in this context. And so now, in that same manner, you got to think: are they making their stuff open source? They're certainly not, right? By his definition, he's saying this is the most critical. They don't make thermonuclear weapon designs open source. And so, for the same reasons, real, actual, true, real AI, as soon as it works, it becomes classified.
Absolutely. So the really good stuff, what you're reading, what gets published is second rate. Think about it that way. It's a strange thought, but it's probably true in many fields. Maybe most fields, maybe all fields. I don't know.
Will has a good quote about this. All computing is military surplus, and it sounds kind of outlandish until you look it up.
This also accounts for why my manuscripts often get rejected, because they just sum it up and they're like, "This is too good to let it out." That's my explanation.
I think there's actually a really good way of kind of making that clear. And when they make a big, we'll show some pictures of this next time. When you make a big computer chip like an Intel, they're going to make something the size of a pizza, basically. And then they're going to cut it up into little tiny, smaller than a postage stamp size chip. And they're going to cut off one little teeny tiny piece. They're going to call that an Intel chip, and they're going to sell it to you for $800 or $900. When the military makes those chips, they don't cut them, right? There's no one, the public has anything. It's called wafer scale integration. And you basically get an entire supercomputer on one single computer chip, right? There's nothing available publicly for the consumer. Yeah, there's actually some startups that are trying to bring this to deep learning because it's so important.
Yep.
That's crazy, but
it's crazy. What are we supposed to do, right? Should we just assume that there's knowledge is being locked up and we'll never get it, and so we should give up? Or perhaps we should try to unlock that knowledge. And that is kind of what's happened with neural networks, right? Neural networks.
Yeah, it's all kind of leaking out because of this archive. All the good stuff is right there, and you can find it anytime you want.
And it's not just the U.S. that's investing in this. So other countries don't have the same standards for classifying all information that may be potentially useful. And what's the other thing? There's a bunch of stuff that the Air Force had been doing for a long time with autonomous flight prior to deep learning. And it seems like a lot of those same capabilities are being achieved in the commercial sphere now. So I'm optimistic is my point.
A perfect example is the Alvin. The Alvin self-driving car, that project started in 84. By 94, they were going 70 miles an hour down the highway with just a camera running, no LiDAR or anything like that. Where did that go? Why did we had cars that could drive themselves on the highway in the 90s, but somehow they just disappeared from the public radar for, almost 20 years.
No pun intended.
Right.
To go. Thank you guys so much for this.
All right, this is amazing. We can let people know. It's a very exciting conversation. So I'm going to post. I want to just process a tiny bit the conversation before I post what we should have planned for next Tuesday. Maybe let's just talk about it a little bit with some of the other professors and other folks in the class. So hold that thought. But I am going to definitely post the Andrew Coward talks plural on Canvas. So please start. Let's start digging into those. It's a good springboard for just for this question of okay, if we want to try to build some of this stuff, these secrets into our new tool, how do we think about doing that? So see you guys on Tuesday, but I will communicate before then. Oh, and this will be recorded also. This has been recorded. In fact, this session and the earlier session of the methods complex systems class that William directs is also recorded. So if you guys, it's a long recording. It's 4 hours or something. So, skip around as you want, but I'll be posting the entire thing. Any questions before I jump off? Not that will lead to too much good conversation because some of us has to go. But any boring questions? All right, awesome. All right, everybody, thanks so much. This was really fun.
Thank you.
Take it easy.
See you next